Don't invite Caleb. Mason is taking his seat.
You already decided.
This isn't an affair. It's a pattern. Before 8:30.
What's happening? They're here.
Frank Baker was 41, a senior financial fraud investigator who looked more like a quiet suburban accountant than someone trusted with multi-million-dollar corporate investigations. Most people believed he was too soft to confront anyone, especially his wife. Leah's co-workers often joked that Frank was the nicest man in Illinois. Every morning he brewed his own coffee, drove the same 6-year-old Toyota Highlander to work, and never missed Sunday dinner with his family. What they didn't know was that he had spent months assembling evidence capable of bringing down an entire executive team. Then, as they decorated the Christmas tree, Leah looked at him without hesitation and said, "Don't invite Caleb this year. Mason is taking his seat at our Christmas dinner." Frank's fingers tightened around a fragile glass ornament until the thin crack echoed through the silent living room. If you're enjoying this story, let me know where you're watching from and what your local time is right now. I always love seeing how far these stories travel. And if you enjoy slow-burn stories where patience, truth, and quiet strength win in the end, consider subscribing so you won't miss tomorrow's story. By the second week of December, Christmas had begun settling over Naperville like fresh snow. White lights stretched across maple trees lining Jefferson Avenue. Front porches glowed beneath oversized wreaths. Every evening, children bundled in thick coats ran across neighborhood lawns chasing one another, while their parents balanced paper cups of hot chocolate during block holiday gatherings. Frank Baker had always loved this season, not because of the decorations, not because of the presents, because Christmas had rules. The same dinner, the same music, the same people around the same table. His father had started the tradition nearly 30 years earlier, long before cancer took him. Every Christmas Eve, the Baker family gathered at 6 o'clock sharp. Roast turkey came out first. Evelyn baked the pecan pie herself. Caleb always carved the turkey after Frank insisted he did it better. Then they exchanged one gift at a time, instead of opening everything at once. The routine never changed. Frank believed some things should never change. That Monday evening, he parked his Toyota Highlander inside the garage, exactly as he had every weekday for years. The dashboard clock read 5:43 p.m. He carried 2 grocery bags into the kitchen, fresh cranberries, sweet potatoes, a bottle of sparkling cider Evelyn liked. Leah barely looked up from the island counter. Her company laptop was open beside a half-finished glass of white wine. Several colorful marketing slides filled the screen. "You bought too much," she said without lifting her eyes. "It's Christmas." "We don't need food for 10 people. Frank quietly unpacked the bags. "We're having 6. We're having 4. Her voice was casual, almost rehearsed. Frank paused while placing butter inside the refrigerator. "I already told Mom we'd all be here." Leah finally looked at him. "Plans changed." She said it the same way someone mentioned tomorrow's weather. No apology, no hesitation. Frank closed the refrigerator door. "What changed?" "Mason's staying in town." Silence settled between them. Leah continued typing another sentence before speaking again. "His parents are in Arizona." Frank nodded once. "I remember. They're spending Christmas with his sister." "I know. So he'll be alone." Frank waited. Leah smiled faintly. "I invited him." Frank said nothing. She interpreted the silence as agreement. He shouldn't spend Christmas by himself. He has friends. He does. He has co-workers. Yes. He has options. Leah sighed. "You don't understand." Frank rested both hands on the kitchen counter. "Help me understand." "Mason has done so much for me this year." Frank listened. "He covered meetings while I was sick. He introduced me to clients. He recommended me for the regional campaign. He deserves to be with people. Frank watched the reflection of the Christmas lights in the kitchen window. Outside snow had begun falling again. Tiny flakes drifted through the glow of the porch light. Finally, he asked the question already forming inside him. So, who's not coming? Leah answered immediately. Caleb. The name hung in the room. Frank looked at the dining table. 6 chairs, 1 at each end, 4 along the sides. Every chair already had its place in his mind. His mother's chair, Leah beside him, Caleb across the table, the empty place where his father used to sit. Now Leah was rearranging them without asking. He'll understand, she said. Frank slowly turned toward her. Did you ask him? No. Did you ask me? I didn't think I needed to. Frank looked at her for several long seconds. Not angry, not shocked, simply studying the woman he had been married to for 14 years. Leah mistook the quiet for surrender. She smiled again. You've always been flexible. That sentence stayed with him. Flexible, not respected, not included. Flexible. He picked up another grocery bag and carried it toward the pantry. Inside were Caleb's favorite pecans. Frank had bought them automatically, like every year, without thinking, without imagining there would be no Caleb this Christmas. He quietly placed the bag on the shelf. Dinner passed with ordinary conversation. Leah talked about Horizon Health Solutions, a new marketing campaign, year-end bonuses, holiday parties downtown. She mentioned Mason's name 6 times. Frank counted without meaning to. He had trained himself over years of investigations to notice repetition. People revealed patterns long before they revealed intentions. After dinner, Leah disappeared upstairs to finish another presentation. Frank remained downstairs. The Christmas tree stood in the corner beside the fireplace, half decorated. He picked up a faded wooden ornament shaped like a soldier. Caleb had painted it when he was 11 years old. Blue paint still stained one side where small hands had slipped. Frank smiled despite himself. His phone vibrated. A message from Evelyn. Everything ready for Christmas. Love you both. He stared at the screen. His thumbs remained motionless. Instead, he opened another conversation. Caleb. The last message was from Thanksgiving. Looking forward to Christmas, brother. Frank inhaled slowly. Then he typed. Hey, something came up this year. Leah invited one of her co-workers for Christmas Eve, so dinner's getting smaller than expected. I'm sorry. Can we celebrate together the day after Christmas instead? He read the message 3 times, deleted one sentence, added another, deleted it again. Finally, he pressed send. 3 gray dots appeared almost immediately. Caleb replied within 30 seconds. No worries. Tell Leah Merry Christmas. We'll catch up afterward. Frank stared at the message longer than necessary. His younger brother had always made difficult things easier for everyone else. Even now. Especially now. There was no complaint, no guilt, no anger, just acceptance. Frank knew exactly what those words cost him. Across town, Caleb would spend another Christmas alone inside the small townhouse he had rented after leaving the army. The silence weighed heavier than any accusation. A floorboard creaked upstairs. Leah was walking toward the bedroom. Frank slipped the phone back into his pocket. The following afternoon, Evelyn called. Her voice carried the warmth of someone who had spent all morning baking. I talked to Caleb. Frank closed his office door before answering. I figured. He sounded cheerful. He always does. There was a pause. Then she asked quietly, What happened? Frank looked through the office window toward downtown Chicago. Snow covered the sidewalks below. It was Leah's decision. I see. Another silence. Evelyn never rushed conversations. Your father always said Christmas makes people reveal what matters most. Frank remembered. His father had repeated the phrase every December, not as advice, as observation. What matters eventually finds a seat at the table. Frank had been too young then to understand. Now the sentence returned with unexpected weight. That evening, Leah excitedly described the menu she wanted. Imported wine, prime rib instead of turkey, modern table settings instead of Evelyn's old holiday china. Frank listened quietly. Every tradition disappeared one decision at a time. Later that night, after Leah fell asleep, Frank walked downstairs. The living room was dark, except for the Christmas tree. Colored lights reflected softly across polished hardwood floors. He stood there for nearly a minute before entering his home office. He opened his laptop. Several secure folders filled the screen. Audit reports, vendor payments, corporate reimbursement records, nothing personal, nothing emotional, just numbers. He clicked on a spreadsheet he had reviewed 2 weeks earlier. Rows of vendor payments appeared. One line immediately drew his attention. Authorized partnership expenses, approval chain, regional marketing, executive sponsor. A familiar name appeared beside the authorization field. Mason Reynolds. Frank leaned closer. The payment amount wasn't unusual. The approval sequence wasn't unusual. But one vendor identification number looked strangely familiar. He searched another file, then another. The same vendor appeared again. Different project, different month, same approval path, same executive, same name. Mason Reynolds. Frank's expression never changed. He simply opened a fresh notebook, wrote today's date, copied the vendor number, circled it once, then reached for another file. Some patterns only became visible when someone was patient enough to keep looking. Frank Baker had never believed that fraud announced itself with dramatic moments. It almost always arrived disguised as ordinary paperwork, a duplicate invoice, an unnecessary approval, a payment made on a Friday afternoon when everyone wanted to leave early. The numbers rarely lied. People did. That lesson had followed him through nearly 2 decades of financial investigations. At 24, Frank had joined a regional accounting firm outside Chicago. His work had been routine, at first annual audits, tax reconciliations, compliance reports for manufacturing companies across northern Illinois. Then one assignment changed everything. A family-owned construction company had reported shrinking profits despite record revenue. The executives blamed inflation. The accountants blamed supply costs. The bank blamed poor management. Frank blamed none of them. Instead, he spent 4 days reading invoices no one else considered important. He noticed one trucking company had billed exactly $48,732.163 separate times over 18 months. Not approximately. Exactly. The same amount. The same cents. The investigation eventually uncovered nearly $8 million hidden through shell vendors. Frank had earned a reputation that stayed with him ever since. He wasn't brilliant because he understood complicated mathematics. He was dangerous because he noticed repetition, patterns. Human beings were creatures of habit, even criminals, especially criminals. That habit had eventually led him into financial fraud investigations. His office occupied the 8th floor of a federal contracting building in downtown Chicago. No corner office, no impressive view. Just a quiet room with gray walls, 2 filing cabinets, and a coffee maker, older than some interns. Frank preferred it that way. Less noise meant more concentration. The morning after Leah excluded Caleb from Christmas dinner, Frank arrived before sunrise. The parking garage was nearly empty. He greeted the same security guard, used the same elevator, unlocked the same office. Routine helped him think. His first task had nothing to do with Horizon Health Solutions. A hospital acquisition case required 2 signatures before noon. He completed the review, approved the paperwork, answered 3 emails. Only then did he open the folder labeled simply HHS Review. The folder had existed for almost 4 months, not because Horizon Health Solutions had become a formal investigation. It hadn't. The company had merely appeared during another compliance review involving medical software vendors. Frank's assignment had technically ended weeks ago, but one inconsistency refused to leave his mind. He opened a spreadsheet containing vendor payments from the previous fiscal year. Thousands of transactions filled the screen. Most looked perfectly ordinary. Software licensing, advertising agencies, medical conference expenses, equipment leases. Nothing alarming. He filtered the spreadsheet by vendor identification number. The company he had noticed the previous evening appeared 7 times. Ashford Consulting Group, registered in Delaware. Corporate address. Wilmington, annual payments. Just under $400,000. Not enough to trigger automatic federal reporting thresholds. Frank leaned back in his chair. Companies committing fraud often avoided round numbers. Anything above certain internal audit limits attracted unnecessary attention. Staying just below review thresholds made suspicious payments disappear inside ordinary accounting traffic. He opened another document. Vendor registration records. Ashford Consulting Group listed only 3 employees. Odd. Its invoices claimed nationwide consulting services. Frank searched publicly available business records. The registered office belonged to a commercial mail forwarding service. Again, not illegal, not uncommon. Just another small detail. He wrote another note inside his legal investigation notebook. Commercial mailbox. Verify operational presence. He moved on. Another vendor. Pioneer Growth Partners. Different company, different invoices. Same approval chain. Regional marketing. Strategic partnerships. Executive sponsor. Mason Reynolds. Frank narrowed his eyes. Not because Mason's name appeared, because it appeared too consistently. Healthy organizations distributed approvals across multiple executives. Horizon seemed unusually dependent upon one department. He opened quarterly spending summaries. Marketing expenses had increased nearly 37% within 18 months. Revenue had grown only 9%. Interesting. Not proof. Just unusual. He never confused suspicion with evidence. Years earlier, one of his mentors had repeated the same lesson during training. Evidence survives cross-examination. Assumptions don't. Frank had never forgotten. Around 10:30, his office phone rang. It was Denise Porter from another investigation team. Coffee. Frank smiled slightly. 5 minutes. They walked downstairs together to a small cafe across the street. Denise stirred cream into her coffee. You look busy. Year-end reviews? You always look busy. Frank shrugged. She laughed. You know, one day you're going to retire and realize you've spent your whole life staring at spreadsheets. I doubt it. You ever get tired of numbers? No. Why not? Frank looked through the cafe window. People hurried along snowy sidewalks carrying wrapped presents, because numbers don't panic when questioned. He didn't say it aloud. Instead, he answered simply. They're honest. Denise laughed again. Only you would say that. Back upstairs, Frank received another email. Subject line, vendor documentation request. It came from Horizon Health Solutions. Routine. One of their compliance officers was responding to an unrelated request submitted weeks earlier. Frank downloaded the attached files. Invoices. Contract summaries. Vendor certifications. Nothing confidential beyond authorized disclosure. Everything had been provided legally. He began reading. The contracts themselves appeared professionally written. No obvious red flags, no forged signatures, no missing pages. Then he reached Appendix C, Consulting Deliverables. He slowed. The language repeated itself. Entire paragraphs appeared identical across contracts supposedly written months apart for different vendors. Even punctuation matched. Frank highlighted the sections, copied them into another document, compared line by line, 94% identical. Consulting work worth hundreds of thousands of dollars should never produce identical deliverables. Not impossible, just improbable. His instincts sharpened. Still, instincts were never enough. He needed evidence, hard evidence. He closed the files, opened a blank investigation timeline. September. Vendor approval. October. Invoice submitted. November. Payment released. December. Additional consulting contract. The sequence repeated itself 7 separate times. Every project, every vendor, every approval. Frank wasn't looking for coincidence anymore. He was measuring probability. Late that afternoon, Leah texted him. "Don't forget Mason likes Cabernet. Could you stop by Binny's after work?" Frank read the message twice. No greeting, no question, just a reminder. He replied, "Sure, nothing more." He returned to the spreadsheet. This time he sorted every payment authorized under Mason Reynolds' executive approval code. More than 300 transactions appeared. Most were legitimate. Some required additional review. 4 immediately caught his attention. Each had been approved within minutes of another transaction routed through different departments. Layering. Again, not illegal, but layering frequently appeared in procurement fraud. He printed nothing, downloaded nothing unauthorized. Every action followed company policy and federal investigative guidelines. Chain of custody mattered. Evidence obtained improperly often became useless. At 5:48, Frank shut down his computer. His notebook remained open. 7 vendor names, 3 question marks, 2 circles, 1 sentence. Patterns deserve patience. Snow covered Interstate 88 during the drive home. Traffic crawled. Holiday music played softly through the speakers. Frank barely heard it. His mind replayed approval dates, vendor numbers, contract language. Something still didn't fit. Not the invoices. Not Mason. Something smaller. Something hidden between the transactions. He reached home shortly after 7. Leah was already setting the dining table. She looked unusually cheerful. "Mason says he found the perfect bottle for Christmas." Frank removed his coat. "I'm sure he did." "He has great taste." Frank nodded politely. She continued talking about holiday centerpieces and expensive wine pairings. Frank listened. Not because the conversation interested him, because he had learned long ago that people often revealed more while speaking about ordinary things than during arguments. Leah casually mentioned another company event. Mason handled all the vendor negotiations himself. Frank stopped halfway to the staircase. "What vendors?" "Oh, the event planning companies." She smiled. "I don't remember the names." Frank smiled back. Neither did he. Yet. But he intended to. Later that night, after Leah fell asleep, Frank reopened his notebook. He stared at one invoice longer than all the others. Vendor number AG 44127. He had seen those last 5 digits before. Not inside Horizon's files. Somewhere else. Somewhere entirely different. He opened another archived investigation from nearly 2 years earlier. The search returned one result. Frank's hand stopped moving across the mouse. The same vendor identification number appeared in an entirely unrelated corporate fraud investigation that had ended 18 months ago. He didn't blink. He simply stared at the screen as the pieces began moving into places no one else had yet imagined. 3 nights later, Horizon Health Solutions held its annual Christmas gala at the Grand Ballroom of the Palmer House Hotel in downtown Chicago. The event had become something of a tradition inside the company. Executives called it a celebration of another successful year. Employees called it the only night when vice presidents bought drinks for interns. Marketing banners stretched across the ballroom entrance. A 12-foot Christmas tree stood beneath an enormous crystal chandelier. Gold ornaments reflected hundreds of tiny lights, while a jazz quartet played softly near the dance floor. Servers carried silver trays filled with champagne glasses and miniature crab cakes. Everything looked expensive. Everything looked successful. Frank adjusted the cuffs of his charcoal suit before stepping through the revolving doors. He disliked large corporate parties, not because he felt uncomfortable, because everyone performed. Nobody behaved naturally when surrounded by coworkers and executives. For an investigator, performances were interesting. Truth usually hid somewhere behind them. Leah descended the grand staircase a few moments later. She wore a deep, emerald evening gown that matched the holiday decorations almost perfectly. Several coworkers complimented her before she even reached the ballroom floor. She smiled effortlessly, confident, beautiful. Frank remembered the first time he had seen her nearly 16 years earlier. She had possessed that same smile. Back then, it had been directed at him. Now it seemed reserved for everyone else. "You clean up nicely," she said while straightening his tie. "You look beautiful." "Thank you." For a brief moment, they resembled the couple they used to be. Then someone called Leah's name. "Leah." She turned immediately. "Mason." A tall man crossed the ballroom with practiced confidence. Mason Reynolds looked exactly like the sort of executive magazines loved to feature. Perfectly tailored navy tuxedo, bright white smile, hair carefully styled, expensive watch visible beneath one cuff. He walked as though every room belonged to him. "There you are," Mason said warmly. He opened his arms. Leah laughed before embracing him. Not a long embrace, not inappropriate, just familiar. Too familiar. Frank watched quietly. Mason finally turned toward him. "There he is." He extended his hand. "Frank." Frank shook it firmly. "Mason." "Glad you could make it." "So am I." Mason laughed. "I keep telling Leah she married the calmest man in America." Several nearby employees chuckled. Frank smiled politely. "I've heard worse." "You've definitely got more patience than I do." Leah laughed again. "Frank never gets upset." "Never?" Mason asked. "I've honestly never seen it." "He doesn't argue. He doesn't complain. He just accepts things." Another round of laughter. Frank maintained his pleasant expression. Inside, however, he quietly stored every sentence. People often revealed what they truly believed when they joked. Apparently, everyone here believed he lacked a backbone. Fine. Misunderestimation had never hurt an investigator. It often helped. The evening continued with introductions, regional directors, department heads, outside consultants, board members. Frank recognized several names from reports he had reviewed over the past year. Not because he had investigated them, simply because financial investigators developed remarkable memories for names attached to large budgets. Leah drifted naturally toward Mason throughout the evening. When photographers requested pictures, they somehow ended up standing beside each other. When executives gathered around the cocktail tables, Mason always seemed to pull out the chair beside him for Leah. Nobody appeared surprised. In fact, one woman from Human Resources smiled knowingly. "Our favorite work couple." Leah laughed. "Oh, stop!" But she never corrected the description. Mason raised his champagne glass. "We practically finish each other's sentences." More laughter. Frank sipped sparkling water. Someone beside him leaned over. "You must be used to sharing her." The speaker was smiling. He clearly intended it as harmless humor. Frank answered calmly, "I trust my wife." The man nodded awkwardly. Somehow that answer ended the conversation faster than any sarcastic comeback could have. An hour later, dinner was announced. Round tables filled the ballroom. Frank noticed something interesting before taking his seat. The seating arrangement. Executives had intentionally placed departments together. Marketing occupied 2 adjacent tables. Strategic partnerships sat directly beside them. Finance had its own section farther away. Reasonable. Until he noticed one exception. Although Leah officially belonged to marketing, her assigned seat remained beside Mason instead of her own department director. Again, not proof of anything. Simply another small inconsistency. Dinner began with polite speeches. The CEO praised record growth, revenue, innovation, expansion, healthcare transformation, the usual corporate language. Frank barely listened. Instead, he watched. Executives applauded at different moments. Some glanced toward certain colleagues before clapping. Others avoided eye contact altogether. Office politics often spoke through body language long before words. After dessert, the ballroom transformed into an informal networking event. Small conversations formed naturally. Frank wandered toward one corner where several senior managers discussed upcoming projects. Nobody paid much attention to him, another advantage of appearing ordinary. He picked up a coffee and stood nearby. A woman wearing an executive name badge lowered her voice. The Horizon Connect rollout. Another executive nodded. We're still waiting for the consulting deliverables. Someone else replied. Ashford says everything will be finished before January. Frank froze internally. Ashford. The same vendor. He continued stirring his coffee as though he hadn't heard anything. Another voice joined the discussion. Didn't Pioneer handle that phase? No. They subcontracted part of it. We had to split procurement. Frank looked down into his untouched coffee. Subcontracting. Interesting. He quietly memorized every company name mentioned. Ashford, Pioneer, Northbridge Analytics. 3 vendors, all connected. Before anyone noticed him listening, he casually walked away. Near the ballroom entrance stood a decorative display featuring framed photographs from Horizon's history. Company milestones, ribbon-cutting ceremonies, executive retreats. Frank examined them without much interest, until one photograph caught his attention. A charity golf tournament from 18 months earlier. Standing beside Mason was another executive Frank recognized immediately. David Mercer, former Chief Procurement Officer, except David Mercer no longer worked at Horizon. Frank knew why. Officially, Mercer had retired early. Unofficially, he had quietly resigned shortly before an unrelated federal procurement inquiry involving another corporation. The investigation had produced insufficient evidence for criminal charges. Still, Frank remembered the name. Investigators never truly forgot names, especially names connected to procurement. A waiter interrupted his thoughts. Fresh coffee, sir? Thank you. Across the room, Leah laughed loudly at something Mason had said. Frank watched them only briefly. He wasn't jealous. Jealousy clouded judgment. Observation required emotional distance. Leah touched Mason's arm while speaking. Mason leaned closer. Several co-workers smiled. One of them joked loudly enough for nearby tables to hear. If these two aren't married in another life, I don't know who is. The group burst into laughter. Frank noticed Leah blush. She shook her head. You guys are impossible. Still, she never denied it. One older executive spotted Frank standing alone. He approached carrying 2 glasses of whiskey. You must be Frank. I am. I'm Richard Collins. Operations. They shook hands. I've heard you're with financial investigations. Frank nodded. Mostly compliance work. Richard smiled. Boring stuff. Usually. I could never do it. Too many spreadsheets. Frank chuckled softly. They tell stories. Richard laughed. Only an investigator would say that. Before walking away, Richard casually added one sentence. If you ever meet our procurement team, tell them to stop inventing paperwork. He laughed as though making a joke, then disappeared into another conversation. Frank's smile faded. Inventing paperwork. Interesting phrase. Perhaps meaningless. Perhaps not. At 9:30, awards were presented for employee achievements. Leah received recognition for regional marketing excellence. Mason personally handed her the plaque. The audience applauded. He hugged her again. Photographers captured the moment. Flash after flash illuminated the stage. Frank clapped with everyone else, proud of her success, conflicted by everything surrounding it. As Leah stepped down from the stage, she looked toward Frank. He smiled sincerely. She smiled back. For just 1 second. Then Mason whispered something that made her laugh again. The evening finally came to an end around 10:15. Guests collected coats and holiday gift bags. Outside, snow-covered State Street. The city glowed beneath Christmas lights. Frank and Leah walked toward the parking garage in silence. Halfway there, Leah finally spoke. "Did you have fun?" "I learned a few things." She smiled. "Like what?" "Your company has impressive people." "We do. Mason certainly knows everyone. He practically built half our partnerships." Frank nodded. "I noticed." She slipped her arm through his. "I know tonight wasn't really your scene." "It's okay. You were quiet." "I usually am." She laughed softly. "That's one thing I love about you." Frank glanced toward her. "What is?" "You never make scenes." He didn't answer. Because she was right. He never made scenes. He made timelines, connections, evidence. By the time they reached the garage, Frank had already arranged every conversation from the evening inside his memory. Vendor names, department structures, executive relationships, procurement comments, charity photographs, casual jokes. Individually, none of them mattered. Together, they began forming a picture. Not a complete one. Not yet. But enough for Frank to realize one uncomfortable truth. Whatever was happening inside Horizon Health Solutions extended far beyond Mason Reynolds, and if that picture continued growing the way he suspected it would, Christmas dinner might become the least painful event waiting for the Baker family. The following Saturday began like dozens of Saturdays before it. Frank woke before sunrise without an alarm. Years of investigative work had trained his body to respect quiet mornings. The house remained silent. Outside, fresh snow covered the neighborhood in an unbroken sheet of white. The only sounds came from a snowplow somewhere down the street and the distant whistle of a freight train crossing the DuPage River. Frank brewed coffee exactly the way he always had. Fresh beans, no sugar, a small splash of cream. Routine gave him clarity. Leah didn't come downstairs until nearly 8:30. She appeared exhausted, still wearing an oversized sweatshirt from Horizon Health Solutions. "There you are," she said while rubbing her eyes. "I've been up for hours." "I know. You always are." She poured herself coffee before dropping into the kitchen chair. "I have to finish next quarter's presentation." "Working today?" "Half the company is." Frank nodded. December often demanded more from executives than any other month. Budgets closed, contracts renewed, performance reviews finalized. It was the perfect season for legitimate business. It was also the perfect season to hide fraudulent business. "Do you mind if I use the dining room?" Leah asked. "My office is a disaster." "Of course." Within 20 minutes, the dining table disappeared beneath folders, color printouts, expense reports, presentation binders, and her company-issued laptop. Frank glanced at everything only once. He had spent his career learning where not to look. Professional ethics mattered. Curiosity without authorization destroyed investigations. Around noon, Leah's phone rang. "Mason?" She smiled immediately. "Hey." Frank continued reading the newspaper. "Yes, I'm almost done." She laughed. "No, the vendor packets are right here." Frank lowered the newspaper almost imperceptibly. "Vendor packets." "I know. I'll bring everything Monday." Another pause. "What?" She laughed louder. "No, Frank isn't paying attention." Frank continued pretending to read. "He's reading." "Exactly." She laughed once more. "See you Monday." She ended the call. "You two sound busy." Leah stretched. "Year-end procurement." "Lots of paperwork." "So I've noticed." She gathered several folders together. One binder slipped from the edge of the table. Dozens of papers scattered across the hardwood floor. Oh no. Frank immediately stood. I've got them. Together they knelt to collect the documents. Frank never deliberately read the pages. He simply handed each sheet back exactly as he found it. Then one page landed face up beside his knee. The heading caught his eye before he could avoid it. Vendor Performance Summary. Below it appeared a familiar name. Ashford Consulting Group. Frank's expression remained unchanged. He picked up the page. Here. Leah thanked him without noticing. She stacked everything together carelessly. I swear paperwork multiplies overnight. Frank smiled faintly. It usually does. She laughed. If only you knew. Actually, he suspected he did. That afternoon, Leah drove to a nearby coffee shop to meet another marketing manager. I'll only be gone an hour? No rush? Once she left, Frank decorated the front porch with fresh evergreen garlands. Then he replaced 2 burned-out Christmas lights near the garage. Simple work. Quiet work. His phone vibrated. Caleb. Busy. Not anymore. You want lunch? Frank looked toward the empty driveway. Absolutely. They met 30 minutes later at a small, family-owned diner neither brother had visited in almost a year. Nothing fancy. Red vinyl booths, bottomless coffee, homemade chili. The waitress recognized them immediately. Long time. It has been. Caleb smiled. He looked older than 40 should. Military service had carved permanent lines around his eyes. His shoulders remained broad, but years of carrying heavy equipment had left him moving more carefully than before. You look tired, Caleb observed. So do you? They laughed. The conversation began with ordinary topics. Football, snow, their mother's latest attempts to reorganize the garage. Eventually, Caleb leaned back. You don't have to apologize anymore. Frank looked up. For Christmas. I know why you're here. I'm sorry. I believe you. Frank studied his younger brother. You really aren't upset? Caleb smiled sadly. I didn't say that. Silence settled between them. I just know it wasn't your decision. Frank nodded once. No. Caleb stirred his coffee. You know what bothers me? What? It's not missing dinner. He paused. It's realizing someone actually thought I was the easiest person to remove. Frank had no answer, because Caleb was right. Nobody had suggested asking Mason to celebrate another day. Nobody had suggested a larger table. The easiest solution had been removing family. That realization hurt more than the invitation itself. I keep thinking about Dad, Caleb admitted. He would have hated this. He would. He believed Christmas belonged to family. Frank remembered. Every year their father had repeated exactly the same toast. The table is only complete when everyone who belongs is sitting around it. Now one chair would remain occupied, just not by family. Caleb forced a smile. So, enough depressing conversation. You catch the Bears game? Frank laughed softly. Terrible transition. I tried. By the time lunch ended, both brothers felt lighter. Not because the problem had disappeared, because neither carried it alone anymore. As Frank drove home, his phone rang again. This time it was an unknown number. Mr. Baker? Yes. My name is Melissa Grant. I'm with the Illinois Secretary of State's Business Records Division. Frank immediately became attentive. We're returning your public records request. Of course. He had almost forgotten submitting it. I appreciate the call. The corporate registration documents you requested are available. Thank you. They'll be emailed within the hour. Perfect. The request had been entirely routine, entirely legal, entirely public. Exactly the sort of documentation investigators preferred before making any assumptions. Back home, Frank downloaded the files as soon as they arrived. Corporate registrations, articles of incorporation, registered agents, mailing addresses, ownership declarations. He focused first on Ashford Consulting Group, registered in Delaware, authorized to conduct business in Illinois. Nothing unusual. Then he opened Pioneer Growth Partners, another consulting company, another registration, another mailing address. His eyes narrowed. Both corporations used different names, different legal representatives, different mailing addresses, yet both listed the same accounting firm responsible for annual compliance filings. Coincidence? Possibly. He wrote another note. Verify accounting relationships. He opened Northbridge Analytics, the third company. Different address again, different directors, same accounting firm. Frank leaned back slowly. 3 unrelated vendors. 1 accounting firm, 1 procurement chain, 1 executive approval path. The pattern grew stronger. Still, patterns alone convicted no one. He opened an interactive map. Every registered address appeared inside a 20-mile radius. Interesting. Then he searched property ownership databases. 1 office building housed 2 of the registered businesses. Another commercial mailbox appeared. Again, legal, but increasingly difficult to dismiss. At 6 o'clock, Leah returned carrying holiday shopping bags. "You've been productive." "I finished decorating," she smiled. "It looks beautiful." For a little while, they simply enjoyed the evening together. They wrapped Christmas presents, listened to Bing Crosby, ordered pizza. It almost felt normal again. Then, Leah reached inside 1 shopping bag. "I forgot." She handed Frank a thick folder. "Would you mind putting this in my office upstairs?" Frank accepted it, without opening it, without looking inside. As he climbed the stairs, something slipped from the folder onto the carpet behind him. A sealed white envelope. He picked it up automatically. Across the front, someone had handwritten Executive Procurement Committee. Confidential. Frank immediately placed it back exactly where it belonged. He delivered everything to Leah's office without opening a single page. Later that evening, Leah came downstairs looking relieved. "Thanks." "No problem. I almost forgot that folder." Frank simply nodded. She had no idea how much trust he had just demonstrated. Many spouses would have opened the envelope, read everything, demanded explanations. Frank understood something most people never did. Evidence obtained dishonestly rarely remained useful. Integrity mattered, even when nobody watched. Around 10:30 after Leah had gone to bed, Frank returned to his office. He wasn't thinking about the envelope anymore. He was thinking about the accounting firm. He entered its name into another internal database containing closed investigations. 3 results appeared. His heartbeat remained steady. First investigation. Tax evasion, no charges. Second investigation, bid rigging allegations. Insufficient evidence. Third investigation, corporate procurement fraud. Settled quietly 18 months earlier. The accounting firm itself had never been accused of wrongdoing, but somehow its name continued appearing beside companies whose financial records eventually attracted investigators. Frank closed the database, then opened his notebook once again. Across a fresh page, he wrote 5 names: Ashford Consulting Group, Pioneer Growth Partners, Northbridge Analytics, Mason Reynolds, Hamilton and Pierce Accounting. He drew lines connecting each one, then set his pen down. The web was becoming visible. He simply needed to discover who had spun it. Christmas Eve arrived beneath a pale gray sky that promised more snow before nightfall. Frank stood alone in the backyard shortly after sunrise, brushing fresh powder from the wooden picnic table his father had built nearly 20 years earlier. The cold air stung his face. He welcomed it. Silence had always helped him think. Inside the house, Christmas music drifted through the kitchen speakers. Leah had been awake since dawn. She moved from room to room, arranging candles, polishing wine glasses, and checking recipes with almost military precision. Everything had to be perfect. Every ornament, every plate, every folded napkin. Frank watched through the kitchen window for a moment before returning inside. The familiar smell of cinnamon roasted turkey and fresh bread filled the house. For anyone else, it would have felt like a perfect Christmas. For Frank, every decoration reminded him of one empty invitation. "Could you help me with the dining room?" Leah called. Of course. Together, they carried serving dishes into the formal dining room. The long oak table had always seated 8 comfortably. Frank counted the place settings. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. He already knew which chair Caleb normally occupied. It sat halfway down the left side of the table, directly beneath the framed family photograph, taken 5 Christmases earlier. Leah picked up the name cards. "I almost forgot these." She arranged each one carefully. Mom, Frank. "Leah, Aunt Susan, Uncle Harold, Emily, Jacob, Mason." Frank noticed exactly where she placed Mason's card, Caleb's chair. She never looked at him while doing it. Perhaps she couldn't. Perhaps she simply didn't realize the symbolism. Either possibility hurt. "You think this looks okay?" she asked. Frank forced himself to study the arrangement. "It looks nice." She smiled with relief. "I've been stressing over it all week." "I can tell." She walked toward the kitchen again. Frank remained standing beside the table. His father's words echoed quietly inside his memory. The table is only complete when everyone who belongs is sitting around it. He reached toward Caleb's usual chair, then stopped himself. Nothing would change by moving furniture. Around 11 o'clock, Evelyn Baker arrived carrying homemade pecan pie. Frank hugged his mother tightly. "Merry Christmas." "Merry Christmas, sweetheart." She looked around the house with genuine admiration. "You two always decorate beautifully." Leah smiled warmly. "Thank you." Evelyn noticed the dining table almost immediately. Her eyes paused for less than a second on Mason's name card. Then she looked away. She said nothing. That silence spoke loudly enough. An hour later, Aunt Susan and Uncle Harold arrived. Soon after came Frank's cousin, Emily, with her husband, Jacob. Laughter gradually filled the house. Children from neighboring homes played outside. Snow continued falling gently beyond the living room windows. For a while, the afternoon felt almost normal. Then the front doorbell rang. Leah practically hurried toward the entrance. "I've got it." Frank remained where he was. He already knew who stood outside. The front door opened. "Merry Christmas." Mason Reynolds entered carrying 2 expensive bottles of Cabernet and a professionally wrapped gift basket. He wore a tailored charcoal overcoat over a dark green sweater that somehow matched the holiday decorations. His smile appeared effortless. "Evelyn." He hugged Frank's mother politely. "It's wonderful to see you again." "Good to see you." He greeted everyone individually with remarkable confidence. Within minutes, he behaved as though he had attended family Christmas dinners for years. Frank watched quietly. Mason possessed an unusual social talent. He made strangers comfortable almost instantly. That quality probably explained much of his professional success. It also explained why Leah admired him. "Mason," Uncle Harold laughed, "I hear you're the famous work husband." Several people chuckled awkwardly. Frank noticed Leah blush. "Oh, Harold." "What?" "I'm just repeating what everyone says." Mason laughed smoothly. "I've heard worse." Leah laughed with him. Frank smiled politely. Only Evelyn avoided smiling. Lunch preparations continued. People drifted naturally into conversations. Football played quietly on the television. Coffee brewed in the kitchen. Outside, snow fell harder. Frank noticed Mason wandering through the house with surprising familiarity. He knew where extra serving spoons were stored. He knew which cabinet contained wine glasses. He even opened the pantry without asking. Interesting. Either Leah had described the house in remarkable detail, or Mason had spent more time there than Frank realized. Frank chose not to jump to conclusions. Observations first, assumptions later. At 3 o'clock, everyone gathered around the dining table. Frank waited intentionally before sitting. He watched Mason pull out the chair bearing his name card. Caleb's chair. The moment lasted only seconds, yet it felt much longer. Mason smiled. "Mind if I sit here?" Leah answered before Frank could speak. "That's your seat." Frank quietly took his own place. Grace was offered. Everyone bowed their heads. Frank prayed sincerely, not for justice, not for revenge, only for wisdom. Dinner began pleasantly enough. Conversation centered around childhood Christmas memories, favorite gifts, old family traditions. Evelyn shared stories about Frank and Caleb building snow forts. Everyone laughed. Then Mason spoke. "I wish I'd known your father." Evelyn smiled gently. "He would have liked you." Frank glanced toward his mother. Her expression remained kind, but he knew her well enough to recognize sadness hiding beneath kindness. After the main course, Mason raised his wine glass. "I just want to say something." The room grew quiet. "I know I'm not family." He smiled toward Frank. "But Leah has talked about all of you so often that I already feel welcome." Several relatives nodded politely. "Thank you for including me." Frank raised his own glass. "You're our guest." The words were genuine. Hospitality reflected Frank's character, not his feelings. Still, something about the speech felt carefully rehearsed, almost polished, like a presentation delivered many times before. As dessert arrived, Leah excused herself. "I'll grab the coffee." Mason immediately stood. "I'll help." The two disappeared into the kitchen together. Uncle Harold leaned toward Frank. "They certainly make a good team." Frank simply smiled. "So I've noticed." Minutes later, they returned, carrying coffee cups. Everything appeared perfectly ordinary, yet Frank couldn't ignore one detail. Without speaking, they instinctively divided the work. Leah poured coffee. Mason distributed cups. Each anticipated the other's movements naturally. Habit, not coincidence. Years of working together had clearly created unconscious routines. Nothing inappropriate, nothing illegal, simply remarkably practiced. Around 6:30, the family exchanged presents. Laughter returned. Children from neighboring houses knocked on the door, singing Christmas carols. For a little while, the tension faded. Then Frank's phone vibrated inside his pocket. Unknown sender. No phone number. Only an encrypted email notification. Subject: "You are looking at the wrong people." Frank's heartbeat remained steady. He excused himself quietly. "I'll be right back." Inside his home office, he opened the message. No greeting, no signature. One attachment, zip archive, password protected. Below it appeared a single sentence. "The password is your father's birth year." Frank froze. Only family members knew that year by memory. He entered the numbers. The archive opened immediately. Inside waited 5 files, scanned invoices, internal approval emails, bank transfer summaries, 1 spreadsheet, 1 photograph. Frank opened the photograph first. It showed 4 people leaving an upscale restaurant nearly 11 months earlier. Mason Reynolds, David Mercer, an unfamiliar woman, and Leah. Frank stared at the image. Dinner between coworkers meant nothing by itself. Context mattered. He opened the spreadsheet. Vendor payment summaries. Ashford, Pioneer, Northbridge. Amounts matched transactions he had already reviewed. Then he noticed another column. Beneficiary allocation. No names, only initials. Mr. DM, LH. Frank's stomach tightened. Initials proved nothing. Thousands of people shared identical initials. He refused to speculate. Instead, he examined the approval emails. One sender immediately caught his attention. The email account belonged not to Mason, but to someone inside Horizon's accounting department. The anonymous sender had been right. Frank had been looking too narrowly. The network extended beyond procurement, far beyond it. He copied nothing, printed nothing. He simply studied each document carefully. Then his office door opened. Leah stood there. "You okay?" Frank closed the laptop calmly. "Just work." "On Christmas Eve." She smiled sympathetically. "You never really stop, do you?" "I guess not." She walked closer. "Everyone's wondering where you are." "I'll be right there." She kissed his cheek before leaving. Frank remained seated another few seconds. The anonymous files had changed everything. Until now, he had suspected irregular procurement. Now, someone with direct access to internal company records had deliberately contacted him. That meant one of two possibilities. Either an honest insider had finally decided to expose the truth, or someone was carefully setting a trap. Frank closed the laptop, returned to the dining room, smiled naturally, joined the family conversation. No one noticed anything unusual. No one except Evelyn. His mother looked at him once across the table. She didn't ask questions. She simply recognized the expression she had seen on her eldest son's face since childhood. The expression that appeared whenever Frank discovered something important. Something that would not allow him to rest until every piece finally fit together. Frank barely slept after Christmas Eve. The anonymous files remained locked inside an encrypted folder on his laptop, but their contents replayed continuously in his mind. Every invoice, every approval chain, every bank transfer. Most investigators made one dangerous mistake when they encountered anonymous evidence. They believed it immediately. Frank had built his career by doing the opposite. Anonymous evidence was never proof. It was only a direction. Every document had to survive verification before it became useful. At 6 o'clock Christmas morning, while the rest of the neighborhood still slept, Frank sat inside his home office with a legal pad and 3 sharpened pencils. He created a fresh timeline. December, January, February, month after month. He entered only facts he could independently confirm. Public filings, corporate registrations, known employment records, board appointments. He deliberately ignored anything that existed only inside the anonymous package. Not yet. The exercise revealed something unexpected. Nearly every suspicious vendor payment occurred within 48 hours of executive contract approvals. Too consistent, too organized. His phone buzzed. A message from Caleb. "Merry Christmas, big brother. Love you." Frank smiled. He immediately replied, "Love you too. We'll celebrate together next weekend." A few seconds later, another message arrived. "Deal. Tell Mom I'll bring the pie." Simple, normal, family. Exactly what Christmas should have been. Leah finally woke around 8:30. She appeared happier than she had in weeks. "Merry Christmas. Merry Christmas." She wrapped her arms around him. For a moment, Frank allowed himself to forget investigations, vendors, and anonymous emails. He simply held his wife. "I've got one more present for you," she whispered. "You already gave me enough." She smiled. "Open it anyway." Inside the small, wrapped box rested an elegant stainless steel watch. Simple. Classic. Exactly the style Frank preferred. "You remembered. You looked at it 3 months ago." "I did." "You never buy things for yourself." Frank looked at her. "You pay attention. Always." The word lingered longer than either of them expected. Always. Did she? Or had work gradually replaced the marriage they once shared? He pushed the thought away. Not today. Christmas deserved better. The day passed quietly. They visited Evelyn for lunch, exchanged gifts, watched old family videos. Even without Caleb's presence, Evelyn managed to keep everyone smiling. Still, Frank noticed her glance occasionally toward the empty chair that normally belonged to her younger son. Mothers always noticed absence, no matter how carefully others avoided mentioning it. Late that evening, after returning home, Frank finally reopened the anonymous files. This time he examined the spreadsheet line by line. Every transaction included 3 reference numbers: purchase order, invoice, wire confirmation, professional, detailed, almost too detailed. Then, one row caught his attention. Invoice number AC 47,291. Frank recognized the formatting immediately. Not the number itself, the structure. Most corporations followed internal numbering standards. This invoice didn't. Instead, it resembled numbering used by accounting software generated automatically after manual entries. Interesting. He opened another document. Invoice AC 47,292. Then AC 47,295. Several numbers were missing. Possible explanations flooded his mind. Deleted invoices, separate customers, routine gaps. Again, nothing conclusive. He opened Horizon's publicly available procurement disclosures. Large healthcare contractors often released summary spending reports for shareholders. One vendor total immediately stood out. Ashford Consulting, public disclosure, $12.4 million. Anonymous spreadsheet, $12.4 million. Exact match. Good. One document verified. He checked Pioneer. Again. Exact match. Northbridge. Again. Verified. The anonymous package had accurately copied publicly available totals. Whoever assembled it understood Horizon's accounting structure. That dramatically increased its credibility. Still, the critical allegations remained unverified. Frank needed something stronger. Monday morning arrived. The holiday weekend officially ended. Frank returned to his government office before 7. His supervisor, Daniel Ortiz, noticed him almost immediately. "Vacation over?" "Barely," Daniel laughed. "That's government service." Frank entered his office, closed the door, opened secure investigative databases unavailable from home. He searched each vendor independently. Ashford, no active federal investigations. Pioneer, nothing current. Northbridge, no criminal history. Exactly what he expected. Sophisticated fraud rarely involved companies with obvious criminal records. Instead, he searched banking relationships. One institution appeared repeatedly. Midwestern Commercial Bank, legal, common, but worth noting. His office phone rang. "Frank?" It was Marcus Bennett, an FBI forensic accountant Frank had worked with several times over the years. "Merry Christmas." "You too." "You still breathing after family dinners?" "Barely," Marcus laughed. "I've got something strange." Frank leaned back. "What? Remember David Mercer?" Frank's attention sharpened instantly. "Former procurement executive." "That's the one." "What about him?" Marcus paused. "He just purchased a $3 million lake house." Frank remained silent. "Cash." "When?" "Closed last month." "Legitimate income." Marcus hesitated. "That's what I'm trying to figure out." Frank looked slowly toward the notebook lying beside his keyboard. David Mercer, the same executive from the charity golf photograph, the same procurement officer who had quietly resigned. "What triggered your interest?" Frank asked. Marcus answered carefully. "Routine financial reporting. No active investigation." "Not yet." Frank chose every word deliberately. If someone hypothetically wanted to review public procurement relationships involving Mercer, Marcus chuckled. "I'd hypothetically say that's public information." "Understood." Neither investigator violated protocol. Neither disclosed confidential information. Professional conversations often relied upon careful wording. After hanging up, Frank requested publicly accessible property records. The lake house purchase appeared exactly as Marcus described. Cash, no mortgage, purchased through a limited liability company. Frank added another note: research ownership. Around lunchtime, Leah texted, "How's your first day back, busy? Mine too. Mason already scheduled 3 meetings." Frank stared briefly at the message. Nothing suspicious. Nothing unusual. He typed a simple reply. "Good luck. Love you." She answered almost instantly. "Love you too." For several minutes, Frank simply looked at those 3 words. Love you too. He believed she meant them. That belief complicated everything. If Leah knowingly participated in financial fraud, it contradicted nearly everything he knew about her. If she didn't, then someone close to her almost certainly did. Both possibilities carried devastating consequences. That afternoon, Frank continued verifying the anonymous files. Every confirmed detail strengthened the package. Then he reached the internal emails. Unlike invoices, emails required metadata, headers, routing paths, authentication records. The printed copies lacked all of them. Without originals, authentication remained impossible. Unless... Frank noticed something inside one email footer: automatic archive reference. Most people ignored those tiny numbers. Investigators didn't. He entered the archive format into a government reference database. No results. Expected. It belonged to Horizon's private email system. Still, the format itself appeared genuine. Difficult to fake unless someone had direct system access. At 4:15, another encrypted message arrived. No greeting, no signature, only one sentence. "You verified enough. Now verify account ending 8841. Attached beneath the message appeared a bank routing number. Nothing else. Frank immediately checked publicly available banking registrations. The routing number belonged to Midwestern Commercial Bank. The same institution appearing throughout vendor transactions. He smiled faintly. Whoever contacted him understood investigative procedure. Instead of demanding belief, they anticipated verification. That made the sender either remarkably credible or remarkably dangerous. He locked the files again, turned off his office lights, drove home through slow-moving traffic while Christmas decorations still glowed across suburban neighborhoods. When he entered the house, Leah sat on the living room floor surrounded by wrapping paper she hadn't finished cleaning. She looked up. "Long day." "Very," she smiled. "I saved you leftovers." He kissed her forehead. "Thank you." They ate dinner quietly, watched half a movie, discussed nothing about work, nothing about Mason, nothing about anonymous emails. Before bed, Leah suddenly asked a question that caught Frank completely off guard. "Can I ask you something?" "Always. If you ever thought someone at my company was doing something illegal." She hesitated. "Would you tell me?" Frank looked directly into her eyes. "Yes." She searched his face for several long seconds, then nodded. "I'd want you to." "So would I." She smiled weakly. "I don't know why I asked that." Frank did, because somewhere beneath her confidence, beneath the promotions deadlines and endless meetings, something inside Leah had begun sensing that the ground beneath Horizon Health Solutions was no longer as stable as everyone believed. Neither of them realized how soon those quiet suspicions would become impossible to ignore. Tuesday morning began with an uncomfortable silence. Leah left for work before sunrise. She kissed Frank goodbye, as she always did, grabbed her laptop bag, and hurried toward the front door. "I'll probably be late tonight." "Big meeting." She hesitated for only a fraction of a second. "Executive planning." Frank nodded. "Drive safely." "You too." He watched her car disappear down the street before walking back inside. His coffee sat untouched on the kitchen counter. His mind had already moved beyond routine. The anonymous message from the previous afternoon continued repeating in his thoughts. Verify account ending 8841. Nothing more. No explanation. No accusation. Just a direction. Professional investigators learned to appreciate simple instructions. People who fabricated stories usually supplied too much detail. Truth rarely needed embellishment. Frank arrived at his office shortly after 7. He closed the blinds, opened his secure notebook, and reviewed every fact established so far. 3 consulting vendors, shared accounting firm, repeated executive approvals, anonymous internal documents, David Mercer's unexplained real estate purchase, and now, a specific bank account. He refused to access anything outside his legal authority. Instead, he searched public court records involving Midwestern Commercial Bank. Thousands of cases appeared, too broad. He narrowed the search by commercial litigation involving Horizon vendors. Only 2 results remained. One involved Ashford Consulting. Frank opened the filing. The lawsuit had nothing to do with fraud. Instead, it concerned a payment dispute nearly 4 years earlier. Still attached exhibits contained partial banking information. One account number appeared. Ending, Frank leaned back slowly. Interesting. The anonymous sender hadn't invented the account. It existed in public records. That meant the message simply directed him toward information already available. Again, whoever contacted him understood how investigators worked. Never ask someone to break the rules. Guide them toward facts they could legally discover. His office phone rang. Daniel Ortiz stepped inside before Frank answered. Busy. Always. Daniel carried 2 cups of coffee. I thought you could use one. Frank accepted it gratefully. Daniel sat across the desk. You ever hear of Horizon Health Solutions? Frank remained expressionless. Large healthcare contractor? Marketing and procurement. Why? Daniel shrugged. They're bidding on a new federal wellness initiative. Frank listened carefully. Anything unusual? Not yet. Daniel took a sip of coffee. But procurement contracts that size always attract attention. Frank nodded. They should, Daniel smiled. I figured you'd say that. After Daniel left, Frank stared at the closed office door. The timing bothered him. If Horizon secured another major government contract while procurement irregularities already existed, potential losses could multiply dramatically. Still, suspicion wasn't evidence. He needed proof. At lunchtime, Frank called someone he trusted completely, Victoria Hayes, former assistant U.S. attorney, currently a partner at a respected compliance law firm. She answered immediately. Frank Baker. Victoria. What trouble have you found this time? He laughed softly. None. Yet. I have a hypothetical question. I expected nothing less. They had known each other nearly 15 years. Victoria understood investigations almost as well as Frank. If someone anonymously sent financial documents, Frank began carefully, what would concern you most? She answered without hesitation. Authenticity. Exactly. And motivation. Frank remained silent. Victoria continued. People leak documents for 3 reasons. I'm listening. Justice. Revenge. Or self-preservation. Frank wrote the 3 words down. Justice, revenge, self-preservation. Which is most common, the third. People usually start talking when they realize they're about to become the next person blamed. That possibility hadn't escaped Frank. If someone inside a company suddenly cooperates, Victoria continued, it's often because internal power has shifted. Meaning, the people who once protected each other stop trusting each other. Frank thanked her. Before ending the call, Victoria asked one final question. Frank? Yes. Is this really hypothetical? He smiled. It has to be. For now. I thought so. The conversation stayed with him long after lunch. Power shifting, people protecting themselves. Could that explain the anonymous messages? Perhaps. Around 2 o'clock, another email arrived from Leah, running behind. Dinner without me. Sorry, Frank replied with a thumbs up. No questions, no pressure. He refused to investigate his own marriage through text messages. By late afternoon, he made another decision. He drove to Springfield's online corporate archive center through secure government access and requested historical filings for Hamilton and Pierce accounting. Nothing unusual appeared during the first hour. Partnership agreements, office relocations, license renewals. Then, a former partner's resignation, 5 years earlier. Name Jonathan Ellis. Reason conflict regarding client acceptance policies. Frank immediately searched Jonathan Ellis, retired CPA, now teaching accounting ethics at a small university. Interesting. Very interesting. Frank wrote down the professor's public office number. Not to interrogate him, simply to request publicly available historical information. Professional conversations often revealed far more than documents. That evening, instead of going directly home, Frank stopped at Evelyn's house. His mother answered the door, wearing an old blue sweater his father had loved. I wasn't expecting company. I had a little time. I'm glad. She made tea while Frank shoveled fresh snow from her walkway. Neither mentioned Christmas. Neither mentioned Caleb. Eventually, Evelyn carried 2 mugs onto the back porch. You've been thinking too much. Frank smiled. You always know. I don't have to know. I can see it. They sat quietly for several minutes. Finally, Evelyn spoke again. Your father had a habit. What habit? When something bothered him, she smiled gently. He'd start fixing things around the house. Frank laughed. I remember. He repaired the garage door 4 different times. It wasn't broken. No, he just needed somewhere to put his thoughts. Frank looked toward the old wooden shed. His father had indeed spent countless evenings there, not because repairs were necessary, because silence helped him think. You've inherited that. I suppose I have. Evelyn studied him carefully. Whatever you're carrying. She placed one hand over his. Don't carry it alone. Frank squeezed her hand gently. I won't. He wished he could tell her everything. Instead, he changed the subject. How's Caleb? He came yesterday. She smiled warmly. We baked cookies. He seemed happy. I'm glad. So am I. On the drive home, Frank's phone vibrated through the car's Bluetooth system. Unknown number. He answered. Frank Baker. A man's voice spoke quietly. You've been verifying the documents. Frank immediately became alert. Who's this? I can't tell you. You already know I won't trust anonymous accusations. I know. That's why I sent verifiable records. Frank remained silent. The voice continued. You're still missing the most important connection. What connection? Not every payment moved through procurement. Frank gripped the steering wheel tighter. What are you talking about? Marketing. The line fell silent for a second. Then the man added one sentence. Look at conference sponsorships. Click. The call ended. Frank pulled into an empty grocery store parking lot. His heartbeat remained controlled. Conference sponsorships, marketing budgets. That explained something he had overlooked. He had focused almost entirely on procurement because of Mason and David Mercer. But Leah worked in marketing. Marketing departments frequently approved sponsorships, promotional events, consulting campaigns, and branding contracts. Completely separate budgets. Could someone have deliberately divided fraudulent payments across departments? If so, the scheme would become significantly harder to detect. Frank immediately wrote another note. Review marketing expenditures. Not because Leah worked there, because the evidence now pointed there. There was an important difference. When he finally arrived home, the house stood dark. Leah still hadn't returned. At nearly 9:30, the front door opened quietly. She looked exhausted. "I'm sorry." "Long meeting?" She nodded. "The longest." Frank noticed something unusual. She didn't seem merely tired. She seemed unsettled. "You okay?" Leah slowly removed her coat. "Mason and the executive team spent 3 hours arguing." "About what?" She hesitated. "Budget cuts? Marketing? Everyone." She rubbed her temples. "Finance says spending doesn't match forecasts." Frank listened without interrupting. "They're talking about bringing in outside auditors." Frank's eyes remained calm. "What do you think?" "I think—" She stopped. "Yeah, I think everyone suddenly looks nervous." She laughed weakly. "Maybe that's normal." "Maybe." She walked into the kitchen. "You ever get a feeling something's changing?" Frank answered honestly. "Yes." "I've had that feeling all week." She looked at him for several seconds, then quietly said something that neither of them would forget. "If auditors actually come in, I don't think Horizon will ever be the same again." Frank realized at that exact moment that the anonymous whistleblower had not contacted him too early. They had contacted him just before the first cracks began appearing inside the company itself. And once those cracks widened, every carefully hidden secret would begin searching desperately for a way to escape. The rumors began spreading before sunrise. Frank noticed them first, not through official channels, but through patterns. Patterns always spoke before people did. When he arrived at his office Wednesday morning, Marcus Bennett had already left 2 voicemail messages. Neither sounded urgent. Both sounded careful. Frank returned the call immediately. Marcus answered after the second ring. "You've heard what?" "The audit rumors." Frank remained silent. "They're everywhere." "Internal." "Mostly." Marcus lowered his voice. "But 2 accounting firms have already started asking unusual questions." "What kind of questions?" "Contract compliance. Revenue recognition. Marketing expenditures." Frank wrote the last phrase on his legal pad. "Marketing expenditures." Again. The same direction suggested by the anonymous caller. "Anything official?" Frank asked. "Not yet. But something's moving." After ending the conversation, Frank opened Horizon's latest quarterly financial statements. He had reviewed them before. Today he looked differently. Instead of examining totals, he focused on timing. Marketing expenses climbed dramatically during the same quarters. Procurement consulting costs increased. Separately, neither category looked extraordinary. Together, they formed a staircase. Each increase supported the next. Enough to avoid attracting attention. Not enough to trigger automatic alerts. Someone understood financial reporting extremely well. At 9:30, his secure email chimed. Another anonymous message. No greeting, no signature, only 1 sentence. Follow the conferences held in Phoenix, Denver, and Orlando. 3 attachments accompanied the email. Conference brochures, public event schedules, nothing confidential. Frank smiled slightly. Again, only publicly obtainable information. The sender wanted him to connect pieces legally. He opened the Phoenix conference brochure. Horizon Health Solutions appeared as platinum sponsor. Large sponsorship amount? Expected. He opened Denver, again. Platinum sponsor, then Orlando. The same. Nothing unusual. Until he compared sponsor payment dates with vendor invoices already verified. Every conference sponsorship occurred within 5 business days of consulting payments issued to Ashford or Pioneer. Coincidence, possibly. Repeated coincidence, much less likely. Frank created a comparison chart. Conference, vendor payment, executive approval, marketing authorization. The pattern grew clearer. Procurement approved consultants. Marketing funded conferences. Money moved through separate departments before arriving at the same outside vendors. Elegant, complicated, difficult to detect. His office door opened. Daniel Ortiz stepped inside, carrying a newspaper. "You following Horizon?" Frank looked up. They made the business section. Daniel tossed the paper across the desk. Headline: Healthcare Contractor Announces Strategic Cost Review. Frank read the article carefully. Official language, positive tone. No mention of audits. No mention of investigations. Simply strategic financial optimization. Corporate translation. Something expensive had gone wrong. "Interesting wording," Daniel said. "It is." Daniel folded his arms. "You think they're hiding something?" Frank answered honestly. "I think companies don't announce cost reviews unless they need them." Daniel laughed. "Fair enough." Before leaving, he added one more comment. "Someone from Horizon called yesterday asking about procurement compliance training." Frank looked up. "They called you." "Our office." "They wanted educational materials." "When?" "Late afternoon." Frank thanked him. Once alone again, he stared at the article. Education requests, cost reviews, budget arguments, audit rumors. The company's leadership already knew pressure was building. The anonymous whistleblower probably knew even more. Around noon, Frank drove across town to meet Professor Jonathan Ellis. The retired accountant welcomed him into a modest university office lined with ethics textbooks and framed CPA certificates. "You said this wasn't about litigation?" "It isn't." Frank introduced himself. "I'd like to ask about Hamilton and Pierce." Ellis smiled knowingly. "I wondered how long it would take." Frank remained expressionless. "You expected someone." "I expected eventually someone." Ellis leaned back. "I left because the firm changed." "In what way?" "They stopped asking difficult questions." Frank listened carefully. "No confidential client information," Ellis continued. "I won't violate professional ethics." "I understand. But I can discuss culture." Frank nodded. "That's all I'm asking." Ellis folded his hands. "When I joined the firm, unusual transactions triggered conversations. What changed? Growth. Bigger clients. More pressure. And eventually," he paused. Certain partners preferred retaining business instead of challenging explanations." Frank asked quietly, "Did Horizon Health Solutions become a client before or after you left?" Ellis looked directly at him. "After." That single answer carried enormous weight. It revealed nothing illegal. Yet it established timing. Hamilton and Pierce accepted Horizon only after the partner most concerned with ethics had departed. Frank thanked him sincerely. As he reached the office door, Ellis spoke once more. "Mr. Baker?" Frank turned. "If you're investigating anything involving financial integrity?" "Yes." "Remember something." Frank waited. "Fraud rarely begins with greed. It begins with rationalization. People convince themselves they're only borrowing time, only adjusting numbers, only protecting jobs." He smiled sadly. "By the time they realize what they've become, it's already far too late." The words followed Frank throughout the afternoon. Back at his office, he received another unexpected call. Victoria Hayes. "I heard something." "What?" "A law firm in Chicago. They've been contacted about conducting an independent compliance review." "Horizon." "They wouldn't confirm." "But yes." Frank looked through his office window. "So it's real?" "I believe so." Victoria hesitated. "Frank." "Yes." "If outside counsel gets involved." "The company expects exposure." "I know. They don't hire firms like ours because everything is fine." After hanging up, Frank organized every verified fact into chronological order. He deliberately separated assumptions from evidence, verified, public filings, property purchases, conference sponsorships, accounting firm transition, vendor payments, unverified, anonymous emails, internal spreadsheets, beneficiary initials. He refused to mix the two. Professional discipline mattered. Late that afternoon, Leah finally called. "I'll actually be home early." "Everything okay?" "I don't know." She sounded exhausted. "They canceled tomorrow's executive retreat." "Why?" No explanation. "Just canceled." Frank heard voices behind her, people speaking quickly, doors opening and closing. Someone sounded angry. "I've got to go." "See you soon." When Leah arrived home, she looked older than she had the previous week. Not physically, emotionally. She dropped her laptop bag near the couch. "I've never seen the office like that." "What happened?" "Nobody trusts anyone." She walked slowly into the kitchen. "Finance keeps requesting reports. Marketing keeps revising budgets. Legal keeps scheduling meetings." Frank listened quietly. "And Mason?" Leah sighed. "He spent most of the day behind closed doors." "With whom?" "David Mercer." Frank's attention sharpened immediately. "I thought Mercer resigned." "He did. That's why everyone was surprised." Frank carefully hid his reaction. "Did anyone say why he was there?" "No." "But people noticed." She poured herself a glass of water. "You know what's strange?" "What?" "Nobody asked questions. Everyone just pretended it was normal." She laughed bitterly. "That's when I realized everyone was scared." Fear changed organizations faster than investigations ever could. Fear silenced honest employees. Fear encouraged guilty ones to make mistakes. That evening, after Leah went upstairs, Frank returned briefly to his office. He reviewed the anonymous messages one final time. 3 emails, 1 phone call. Every instruction had led to independently verifiable facts. Not a single false lead. Not one exaggerated accusation. Then another encrypted message appeared. This one contained no attachments, only 6 words. Tomorrow they erase the conference records. Frank stared at the screen. For the first time, the anonymous sender had introduced urgency. Not evidence, urgency. Professional instinct immediately warned him to slow down. Anonymous people often created artificial deadlines to manipulate investigators. Still, if conference sponsorship records truly disappeared, valuable evidence could vanish forever. Frank opened a blank notebook page. At the top, he wrote 2 questions. Who benefits if records disappear? Who benefits if I believe they will? Until he answered both, he would take no reckless action. He closed the laptop, turned off the office light. As he walked upstairs, he noticed Leah asleep on the bedroom chair, still wearing part of her business clothes, a stack of financial reports scattered across the floor beside her. One page had slipped from the pile. Across the top, in bold letters, appeared the title that confirmed everything she had told him. Confidential Preliminary Internal Audit Request. Frank did not touch the document. He simply looked at it from where he stood. The audit was no longer a rumor. It had begun. Thursday morning arrived with a feeling Frank had experienced only a handful of times during his career. The investigation had reached a tipping point. He could not yet prove a crime, but he could clearly see that events were beginning to move without him. Organizations often collapsed this way, not through one dramatic revelation, through dozens of quiet decisions made by frightened people at the same time. Frank reached his office before sunrise. His notebook already contained nearly 50 pages. Every page was dated. Every observation separated into one of 2 categories: verified, unverified. That discipline had protected him throughout his career. It would protect him now. At 7:15, Marcus Bennett called. "You watching Horizon?" "Always." Marcus lowered his voice. "I just received something interesting." Frank waited. 3 federal agencies requested publicly available procurement summaries. Frank wrote down every word. Which agencies? The Office of Inspector General, the Department of Justice, and the FBI. Frank remained silent. They're only requesting documents. No investigation has been announced? But that's how these things usually begin. Frank understood exactly what Marcus meant. Before subpoenas, before search warrants, before arrests, investigators gathered publicly available information. They built timelines. They identified people. They looked for inconsistencies. Only then did formal investigations begin. Any names attached? Frank asked. No. But Horizon is definitely attracting attention. After hanging up, Frank leaned back and stared through his office window. The anonymous whistleblower had contacted him weeks before any visible federal activity. That meant one of two things. Either the sender possessed extraordinary inside knowledge, or the sender worked closely enough to the scheme to recognize its collapse before anyone else. Neither possibility was comforting. At 9 o'clock, another encrypted email arrived. This one contained only a scanned calendar page. Several executive meetings had been highlighted in yellow. One meeting stood out. January 12th, outside council. Frank immediately searched Horizon's press releases. Nothing. He searched public corporate disclosures. Nothing. Outside legal counsel had not been announced. Interesting. He placed the calendar inside the unverified folder. Useful, but still only a clue. Around 10:30, Daniel Ortiz appeared again. You free? For a minute. Daniel closed the office door. I got an unusual call. From a federal prosecutor. Frank raised an eyebrow. They weren't asking about you. They wanted general procurement training materials. Frank smiled slightly. They're building background. My thought exactly. Daniel looked thoughtful. You know, when prosecutors start asking basic questions, they already know much more than they're asking. Frank nodded. Usually. Neither man needed to say more. Experienced investigators recognized early warning signs. The government rarely revealed its hand until absolutely necessary. By lunchtime, Frank decided to review every interaction Leah had described during the previous month. Budget meetings, executive retreats, conference planning, arguments, canceled events. One detail suddenly stood out: the canceled executive retreat. Large organizations rarely canceled executive planning sessions without serious reason, especially during budget season. Someone had wanted executives together, then suddenly didn't. Why, Frank circled the date in his notebook. His phone vibrated. Leah. Can you talk? Of course. She sounded anxious. Something happened. What? They announced mandatory document preservation. Frank closed his eyes briefly. There it was. The first official step. What exactly did they say? They sent an email. No files deleted. No emails removed. No records destroyed. Frank answered carefully. That's fairly standard. I know. But people are panicking. She lowered her voice. I've never seen Mason like this. Frank's heartbeat remained steady. How so? He keeps calling legal. He canceled every meeting this afternoon. And, she hesitated, he asked everyone to organize vendor files immediately. Frank thanked her. After the call ended, he wrote one sentence. Document preservation notice. Internal concern confirmed. An hour later, another message arrived, this time from Victoria Hayes. Need 5 minutes, call me. Frank immediately did. Victoria answered. My firm's conflict department just contacted me. Why? They're checking whether we've ever represented Horizon. And we haven't. Frank understood immediately. They're preparing to hire outside counsel. That's my assumption. Victoria paused. Frank? Yes. If they retain independent counsel, they expect exposure beyond routine accounting. Potentially. Frank thanked her. The walls were closing in. Not around him. Around Horizon. The company still functioned. Employees still attended meetings. Marketing campaigns continued, but invisible pressure continued increasing beneath the surface. Late that afternoon, Frank received another anonymous phone call. The same calm male voice. "You saw the preservation notice?" Frank answered quietly. "Yes." "You still don't trust me?" "I don't trust anyone I can't identify." "Good." The man actually sounded pleased. "You shouldn't." Frank waited. "The subpoenas are already drafted." Frank said nothing. "They just haven't been served." "How do you know?" Silence. Then, "Because I helped prepare the records they'll request." Frank's grip tightened slightly around the phone. "Who are you?" "I can't answer." "Were you involved?" Another pause. "When this is over, you'll understand." The line disconnected. Frank remained motionless for nearly a minute. That conversation changed everything. Not because he believed the caller, because of one specific sentence. "I helped prepare the records they'll request." Not destroy, prepare. The whistleblower wasn't trying to erase evidence. Someone was organizing it. That suggested cooperation. Or fear. Perhaps both. At 5 o'clock, Frank left work and drove toward Horizon's headquarters. Not to investigate, not to enter the building. Simply to observe. Employees streamed from the parking garage. Most walked normally. Some gathered in small groups. Several looked down at their phones continuously. Then Frank saw Mason. The marketing director emerged alone, usually confident, usually smiling. Today he looked different. His shoulders were tense. His phone remained pressed tightly against his ear. He walked directly to his car without acknowledging anyone nearby. A black sedan followed him out of the parking structure several moments later. Nothing suspicious. Perhaps coincidence. Perhaps security. Frank made no assumptions. He simply noted the time. Leah exited nearly 20 minutes later. She looked exhausted. Instead of driving immediately, she remained sitting inside her car for several minutes, staring forward, thinking. Eventually, she pulled onto the road. Frank waited another 10 minutes before leaving himself. That evening, they ate dinner quietly. Neither mentioned work at first. Finally, Leah spoke. They announced something else. Frank looked up. "What? Federal auditors may visit next week." "Did they say why?" "No." "They just said everyone should cooperate." She rubbed her forehead. "I've worked there 11 years." "I've never heard those words before." Frank reached across the table and gently held her hand. "You'll be okay." "I hope so." She looked at him. "Frank, if investigators ever came to my office, I'd answer every question honestly." "I know you would." She smiled sadly. "I just wish everyone else would." Later that night, after Leah fell asleep, Frank returned once more to his home office. He organized every verified event in chronological order: vendor payments, conference sponsorships, accounting changes, property purchases, budget disputes, document preservation, outside counsel, possible federal interest, one timeline, one continuous story. Then his encrypted inbox flashed again. Another message. No attachment. Only 9 words. "Tomorrow morning. Federal agents will arrive before 8:30. Frank stared at the screen. He did not know whether the warning was true. He did know one thing. Every previous anonymous prediction had proven accurate. He shut down the computer, closed the office door, and for the first time since Christmas Eve, he realized that by the following afternoon, Horizon Health Solutions might no longer be fighting rumors. It might be fighting the federal government itself. Frank barely slept. At 6 o'clock Friday morning, he was already dressed, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. The anonymous warning echoed through his thoughts. Federal agents will arrive before 8:30. He refused to drive to Horizon. Curiosity was never an acceptable reason to interfere with another organization's affairs. Instead, he followed his normal routine. He drove to his office, reviewed his notes, answered ordinary emails. Professional discipline demanded consistency. At exactly 8:17 a.m., Marcus Bennett called. His voice was calm. "They're here." Frank looked at the clock. "Who?" "FBI. And 2 people from the Office of Inspector General. They just entered Horizon headquarters." Frank closed his notebook. "So the warning was accurate." "It appears so," Marcus continued. "They're serving document subpoenas. Not making arrests. Not today." Frank thanked him and ended the call. He remained seated for several moments. Every anonymous prediction had now been confirmed. The whistleblower possessed direct knowledge of the investigation. That fact could no longer be ignored. By mid-morning, business news websites began publishing short articles. Federal authorities serve records requests to major healthcare contractor. The reports were careful. No allegations, no accusations. Only confirmation that federal investigators had requested documents relating to procurement and financial reporting. The stock market reacted immediately. Horizon shares dropped nearly 12% within the first hour. Investors feared uncertainty more than bad news. Around 10 o'clock, Leah called. Her breathing sounded uneven. "They're everywhere. Take your time. There are agents on every executive floor. They're copying files, interviewing department heads." Frank listened quietly. "No one's been arrested." "No? But legal told everyone not to discuss the investigation. Just cooperate." She paused. "They asked for marketing records." Frank had expected that. "What kind?" "Conference sponsorships." His eyes closed briefly, exactly as the anonymous caller had predicted. "They requested vendor contracts, travel expenses, advertising agreements." Frank asked only one question. "Did they interview you?" "Not yet. They scheduled me for this afternoon." His voice remained steady. "Answer honestly." "I will. I've got nothing to hide." "I know." She became silent, then quietly admitted something. "I'm scared." Frank answered without hesitation. "Being honest is never the wrong decision. I hope you're right." After the call ended, Frank wrote another verified entry. Federal subpoenas include marketing conference records. Every piece continued fitting together. Shortly after noon, Victoria Hayes arrived at his office unannounced. She carried a slim leather folder. "I was nearby." Frank smiled. "Were you—" She laughed. "No. I wanted to see your face." They sat across from one another. Victoria folded her hands. "My firm wasn't hired. Horizon retained another compliance firm." "So it's official?" "Yes." She looked directly at him. "This isn't routine." "What makes you say that?" "They hired both compliance counsel and white-collar criminal defense attorneys." Frank absorbed that carefully. 2 legal teams, one preparing to cooperate, one preparing to defend. Victoria continued. "That combination tells me executives expect personal exposure. Not just corporate liability." Frank nodded slowly. She leaned forward. "Tell me honestly, without violating anything." "Have you been privately investigating this?" Frank answered carefully. "I've been documenting publicly available facts. Nothing more." Victoria smiled. "I expected exactly that answer." She stood to leave. At the door, she paused. "One more thing." "What?" "When organizations start protecting individuals instead of solving problems, they usually collapse quickly." The afternoon moved painfully slowly. Every hour produced another headline. Federal inquiry expands. Horizon cooperating with authorities. Outside counsel retained. Employees leaving headquarters, carrying boxes. Frank ignored speculation. He trusted only confirmed information. At 3:30, Leah finally called again. They interviewed me. How did it go? They were professional. What did they ask? Mostly about conference sponsorship approvals, vendor presentations, and Mason. Frank remained quiet. They asked whether he ever pressured marketing. Did he? She thought carefully. He encouraged projects. He recommended vendors. But what? I never questioned why the same consultants kept appearing. Her voice cracked slightly. I just assumed procurement had already vetted them. Frank understood. Large fraud schemes rarely depended upon one dishonest employee. They depended upon dozens of honest employees trusting ordinary procedures. That trust became the camouflage. What happens now? Leah asked. You continue telling the truth. Nothing else. I feel like I've missed something obvious, Frank answered gently. Most people don't expect coworkers to commit fraud. That's normal. She thanked him. Before ending the call, she added quietly, Mason resigned. Frank froze. When? About 20 minutes ago. He cleaned out his office. No goodbye. No meeting. He just left. That single development changed everything. Executives under ordinary business pressure rarely resigned in the middle of a federal inquiry. They stayed. They defended themselves. Or they cooperated. Leaving immediately suggested fear or advice from legal counsel. Frank added another verified note. Mason Reynolds resigned following subpoena service. At 5 o'clock, Daniel Ortiz appeared again. I figured you'd still be here. I usually am. Daniel tossed another newspaper onto the desk. The online edition had already updated. Horizon executive resigns during federal investigation. So much for rumors, Daniel said. Frank nodded. Daniel lowered his voice. You think criminal charges are coming? I don't know. But resignations usually aren't the end of the story. Daniel agreed. My old supervisor used to say something. What? When rats abandon a ship, the water has already reached the lower decks. After Daniel left, Frank reviewed every event since Christmas. Leah replacing Caleb, Mason becoming increasingly visible, financial patterns, anonymous messages, conference sponsorships, federal subpoenas, executive resignation. The timeline no longer contained gaps. It contained momentum. That evening, Frank arrived home before Leah. Evelyn was already waiting inside. She had brought homemade soup. I thought you two might forget dinner. Frank smiled warmly. You know us too well. She noticed the television. Every business channel carried some version of the same story. Horizon. Frank nodded. It's been a long day. Evelyn looked at her son carefully. You look tired. I am. She placed one hand on his shoulder. Don't forget. What? Whatever happens at that company, your marriage matters more. Frank appreciated the reminder. The investigation had consumed weeks of his attention. But Leah was still his wife. She was frightened, confused, and possibly another victim of people she had trusted. When Leah finally came home after 7, she looked emotionally drained. She hugged Frank tightly before saying a single word. I needed that. He held her quietly. No one knows what's happening. She whispered into his shoulder. People are crying. Some are deleting family photos from their office walls. They think everything's ending. Frank gently stepped back. Did anyone ask you to destroy documents? She looked shocked. No. Quite the opposite. They reminded us again to preserve everything. That answer reassured him. Whatever happened next, the evidence would remain. Later that night, after Leah had gone upstairs with Evelyn, Frank returned to his office one final time. His encrypted inbox contained another anonymous message. No greeting, no explanation. Only one sentence. Monday, they begin taking sworn testimony. Frank stared at the screen for a long moment. The investigation had moved beyond documents, beyond rumors, beyond internal reviews. The next phase would place people under oath. And once sworn testimony began, every lie told over the past several years would become exponentially more dangerous than the truth. Monday morning began with absolute silence. Not because nothing was happening, because everyone was waiting. Frank stood by the kitchen window, watching the sunrise while Leah quietly prepared coffee. Neither of them mentioned Horizon. Neither needed to. The entire weekend had been filled with television coverage, financial analysis, and endless speculation from reporters who possessed very few facts. Frank trusted none of it. Evidence mattered. Opinions did not. Leah finally broke the silence. I don't know whether I'll still have a job next month. Frank walked over and gently took her hand. You'll have something much more important. She looked at him. What? Your integrity. She smiled weakly. I hope that's enough. It always is. Before leaving for work, she stopped at the front door. If they ask me back for another interview, they probably will. I'm telling them everything. Frank nodded. That's exactly what you should do. She kissed him lightly before walking outside. For the first time in weeks, Frank noticed she looked less frightened, not because the danger had disappeared, because she had made a decision. Truth required less energy than deception. Around 9:30, Marcus Bennett called. They've started. The depositions? Voluntary interviews under oath. Frank leaned back in his chair. Who's first? Mostly department directors. Finance. Procurement. Marketing. Frank expected that sequence. Investigators normally worked from process to responsibility. Documents first, people second. Around noon, another encrypted email arrived. There was no attachment, only one sentence. Watch the property records this afternoon. Frank frowned. Property records? He opened publicly available county databases. Nothing appeared unusual. For nearly an hour, he found nothing connected to Horizon. Then, shortly after 1 o'clock, a new filing appeared. Mason Reynolds had listed his lake house for immediate sale. As is, cash offers preferred. The asking price sat well below market value. Frank quietly stared at the screen. People facing ordinary financial pressure sought maximum value. People expecting assets to become vulnerable often sought speed. He saved a copy of the public filing. Verified, public, documented. Nothing more. At 2:15, Leah called. They interviewed me again? How are you doing? I'm exhausted. What did they ask this time? They showed me invoices. Frank remained silent. They wanted to know whether I recognized conference budgets. Did you? Some. Not all. She took a slow breath. They asked whether Mason ever requested that marketing approve expenses outside the normal review process. Frank asked carefully. What did you tell them? The truth. He occasionally asked for expedited approvals. But procurement documents always looked complete. She paused. I never imagined supporting paperwork could be fabricated. Frank answered gently. Most people wouldn't. She became quiet. Frank. Yes. They told me something. What? I'm considered a witness. Not a subject. For the first time in weeks, Frank felt genuine relief. Those 4 words changed everything. Witness, not subject. The investigators had already separated cooperation from suspicion. After ending the call, Frank wrote one additional note. Leah officially categorized as cooperating witness. His phone rang again only minutes later. Victoria Hayes. I thought you'd want to know. What happened? David Mercer retained separate criminal defense counsel. Frank closed his eyes. So he's lawyering up independently. Exactly. What about Mason? He retained another firm this morning. Multiple executives, multiple attorneys, separate representation. That rarely happened unless personal interests had begun diverging. People stopped protecting one another. They started protecting themselves. Late that afternoon, Frank received an unexpected visitor. Caleb. His younger brother stepped into the office wearing jeans and an old leather jacket. "You busy?" "Never too busy for you." Caleb smiled. "I figured." They walked to a nearby coffee shop. For several minutes, they discussed ordinary family matters. The weather, their mother, football. Finally, Caleb looked across the table. "You've been carrying this alone." Frank remained quiet. "I can see it." "I'm managing." Caleb nodded slowly. "I know, but managing isn't the same as sharing." Frank appreciated the observation. "You remember Afghanistan?" Caleb asked. Frank smiled faintly. "I remember your stories. When things went wrong, we survived because nobody carried everything alone." Caleb leaned forward. "You don't have to solve everyone's problems." Frank looked down into his coffee. "I know. Do you?" The question lingered. Perhaps Caleb was right. Frank had approached every stage of this situation as an investigator, but this was also his family, his marriage, his future. That evening, Frank returned home earlier than usual. Leah was already sitting in the living room. Boxes filled with personal belongings surrounded her. He stopped. "What happened?" "They told everyone to remove personal items from executive offices, just in case additional workspaces need securing." She laughed softly. "I packed 11 years into 3 cardboard boxes." Frank sat beside her. Inside one box rested framed photographs, company awards, holiday decorations, a ceramic mug reading Horizon Family. The words felt painfully ironic now. Leah picked up one photograph. It showed an old company picnic, smiling employees. Mason stood several rows behind her. David Mercer stood nearby. At the time, it had meant nothing. Today, every image seemed different. "I trusted them." She whispered the words almost to herself. "I know." "I defended them." "I know." "I invited Mason into our house." Frank gently placed one hand over hers. "You acted based on what you believed." "I should have seen it." "No." She looked at him. "You couldn't have. You weren't trained to look for deception." "I was. And even I needed weeks to understand the pattern." Tears finally reached her eyes. "I hurt Caleb." Frank nodded quietly. "Yes. I hurt you." Another pause. "Yes." She lowered her head. "I thought Mason respected me." Frank chose his next words carefully. "He probably did." She looked confused. "What?" "People can manipulate someone and still respect their abilities. They simply value their own interests more." She thought about that for a long moment. "I hate that you're right." That evening, the family gathered for dinner. Evelyn arrived with homemade bread. Caleb accepted the invitation without hesitation. The atmosphere felt awkward at first. Then Leah stood before anyone began eating. "I owe everyone an apology." The room became completely still. She looked directly at Caleb. "I replaced you at Christmas. I embarrassed you. I chose appearances over family. I'm deeply sorry." Caleb never interrupted. She turned toward Frank. "And I stopped listening to the one person who quietly tried to protect us." Her voice trembled. "I'm sorry." Frank stood and embraced her. No speeches, no dramatic declarations, just forgiveness. Caleb smiled gently. "I came because we're family. Not because everything's perfect." Evelyn quietly wiped away a tear. "I've waited a long time to hear those words." Dinner lasted nearly 3 hours. For the first time since Christmas, genuine laughter returned to the house. Not forced, not polite, real. Late that night, after everyone had left, Frank checked his encrypted inbox once more. Another anonymous message waited. This one contained no warning, no instructions, only 2 sentences. "My job is finished. You already have everything you need." Frank stared at the screen. For the first time, he believed it. The anonymous whistleblower had never asked him to expose anyone, never asked him to intervene, never asked him to break the law. The mysterious sender had simply pointed him toward facts that already existed. Now the federal investigation would continue without hidden guidance. Frank slowly closed the laptop. Upstairs, Leah was already asleep. He joined her quietly. Outside, winter snow continued falling across the neighborhood. Inside, something much heavier had finally begun to melt. The fear that had entered their home on Christmas Eve was slowly being replaced by something far more difficult to earn. Trust. 3 months passed before life finally began to resemble something ordinary again. Winter slowly surrendered to spring. Snow disappeared from sidewalks. The Christmas decorations that had once reminded Frank of betrayal had long since been packed away. For the first time in months, silence inside the Baker home no longer felt heavy. It felt peaceful. The federal investigation continued. New headlines appeared every few days. Former Horizon executives testified. Additional financial records were released. Several outside contractors agreed to cooperate with prosecutors. Frank followed the developments without becoming consumed by them. His role had ended. Now the legal system would finish what investigators had started. One Saturday morning, Frank found Leah standing in the garage, surrounded by cardboard boxes. "What are you doing?" She smiled. "Cleaning." He laughed. "You've declared war on storage." "I've declared war on keeping things we don't need." Together, they spent the morning sorting through years of forgotten belongings, old tax returns, children's drawings from nieces and nephews, camping equipment, holiday decorations. Near the bottom of one box, Leah discovered a small wooden ornament. It was hand-painted. Caleb had made it in elementary school. She stared at it quietly. "I almost threw this away last Christmas." Frank looked at her. "I remember." She turned the ornament over in her hands. "I can't believe how differently I saw everything back then." "You trusted the wrong person." "I also ignored the right ones." Frank wrapped one arm around her shoulders. "We're here now." She nodded. "We are." Later that afternoon, Caleb arrived carrying groceries. "I'm making lunch." Frank smiled. "You're taking over my kitchen again." "Someone has to," Leah laughed. "And this time you're sitting at the head of the table." Caleb grinned. "I never cared about the chair. I cared about the invitation." Those words stayed with everyone, because they were true. It had never been about furniture. It had been about belonging. As lunch continued, conversation turned naturally toward the future. Caleb announced that he had accepted a leadership position with a non-profit organization helping military veterans transition into civilian careers. "I'm excited. It feels meaningful." Leah smiled warmly. "They're lucky to have you." Caleb shrugged. "I think I'm the lucky one." Evelyn, who had joined them shortly before noon, quietly reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "Your father would be proud." The room became still. Frank's father had passed away years earlier, yet his influence remained present. Integrity, patience, family. Those values had quietly guided Frank throughout the entire investigation. That evening, after everyone left, Leah sat beside Frank on the back porch. The air carried the warmth of early spring. "I've been thinking about my career." Frank listened. "Horizon offered me a severance package. They also offered references." "What are you going to do?" She smiled. I accepted another job. His face brightened. Really? She nodded. A regional healthcare foundation. Smaller? Less money. But they focus on community health programs. Frank could immediately hear the difference. She wasn't talking about salary. She was talking about purpose. When do you start? Next month. I'm nervous. You'll be wonderful. She leaned against his shoulder. For the first time in years. I'm looking forward instead of upward. Frank understood exactly what she meant. Success had once been measured by promotions. Now it was measured by peace. Several weeks later, Frank attended a professional conference on financial fraud prevention. For years, he had spoken only about accounting systems and investigative procedures. This year, his presentation changed. Without mentioning Horizon or any confidential investigation, he addressed something different. Corporate culture. He stood before hundreds of investigators. We often focus on documents. We focus on transactions. We focus on spreadsheets. He paused. But fraud usually survives because ordinary people stop asking ordinary questions. The audience listened carefully. Never assume familiarity equals trust. Never assume confidence equals honesty. And never believe integrity can be replaced by intelligence. When the presentation ended, several young investigators approached him. One woman asked, "What's the most important lesson you've learned?" Frank thought carefully before answering. Protect relationships. She looked surprised. I expected something about evidence. Evidence solves cases. He smiled. Relationships protect lives. Weeks later, Leah invited several co-workers from her new organization to dinner. Frank noticed the difference immediately. Conversations centered around patients, volunteers, scholarships, community clinics. No one discussed office politics. Nobody competed for attention. As the evening ended, Leah quietly whispered, "This feels healthier." Frank nodded. It is. Another month passed. One Sunday afternoon, the family gathered at Evelyn's house. The old dining room looked exactly as it always had. The same photographs, the same china cabinet, the same worn wooden table. This time, every chair was occupied by someone who belonged there. Caleb noticed Frank smiling. "What?" "I'm remembering Christmas." Caleb laughed. "I'd rather remember today." "So would I." During dessert, Evelyn raised her glass. "I want to say something." Everyone stopped talking. Families survive because forgiveness is stronger than embarrassment. She looked around the table. We all make mistakes. Some bigger than others, but we're sitting here together. That matters. Everyone quietly raised their glasses. Frank caught Leah looking at Caleb. There was no guilt left in her expression, only gratitude. After dinner, Caleb stayed behind while everyone else cleaned the kitchen. "You okay?" Frank asked. Caleb nodded. "I wanted to thank you." "For what?" "You never forced me to forgive." Frank looked surprised. "I couldn't." "Exactly." Caleb smiled. "You trusted me to get there myself." Frank laughed softly. "I learned that from Dad." So did I. Later that evening, Frank returned home and opened the notebook that had accompanied him through every stage of the investigation. Nearly 100 pages. Dates, names, observations, timelines. Every line represented discipline. Every page represented patience. He slowly turned to the final blank page. Instead of writing another investigative note, he wrote something entirely different. Truth eventually reaches the surface, but relationships require daily care. He closed the notebook forever. Not because the lessons had ended, because they had changed. The investigation had restored facts. The months afterward restored people. As summer approached, laughter once again became common inside the Baker home. Weekend barbecues replaced tense dinners. Family photographs returned to the walls. Leah no longer checked business news every morning. Frank no longer waited for encrypted emails. Life became wonderfully ordinary. One evening, while watering flowers in the front yard, Frank noticed a young couple arguing quietly across the street. The husband looked frustrated. The wife appeared exhausted. Neither seemed willing to listen. Frank watched for only a moment before looking away. Every family carried unseen burdens. Every marriage faced moments of misunderstanding. The difference between survival and collapse often depended on one simple decision: whether people chose pride or truth. He smiled as Leah stepped outside, carrying 2 glasses of lemonade. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. Frank accepted the drink. How close we came to losing everything. She slipped her hand into his. And how lucky we were. Frank shook his head gently. No. We weren't lucky. We chose to fight for each other. She smiled. And we'll keep choosing. Together they watched the sunset in comfortable silence, grateful that the hardest chapters of their lives had become memories instead of their future. Nearly 10 months after the first federal subpoenas were served, the criminal trial finally began. The courthouse stood only a few miles from downtown, but to Frank it felt like the end of a journey that had started on Christmas Eve. Television vans lined the streets before sunrise. Reporters rehearsed opening statements in front of cameras. Employees from Horizon quietly entered through side entrances. Some came voluntarily. Others arrived because they had been subpoenaed. Frank watched the coverage from his office instead of attending in person. He had no role in the prosecution. No testimony had been requested. Everything he knew had either become public record or had already been uncovered independently by federal investigators. That was exactly how it should be. Justice depended upon evidence, not coincidence. Late that morning, Leah called. "I received another subpoena." Frank immediately asked, "To testify?" She answered calmly, "Yes." "When?" "Next Tuesday." "Are you okay?" She paused before answering. "I think I am. I've already told the truth several times. This time I'll simply tell it again." Frank smiled. "Consistency is the easiest part when you're honest." She laughed softly. "I finally understand why you always say that." The first week of testimony unfolded exactly as experienced investigators expected. Federal prosecutors built their case slowly, patiently, methodically. Jurors saw spreadsheets before hearing accusations, contracts before conclusions, bank transfers before motives. Frank admired the strategy. Good prosecutors rarely relied on emotional speeches. They allowed documents to speak first. One evening, Marcus Bennett stopped by the house carrying takeout containers. "I figured nobody wanted to cook." Leah welcomed him inside. "You read my mind." As they ate dinner together, Marcus summarized the public testimony. The procurement manager admitted approval procedures were bypassed. Frank nodded. "I saw that." The accounting supervisor confirmed several consulting invoices lacked supporting documentation. "I saw that too." Marcus leaned back. "The government's not rushing." "They don't have to." Frank agreed. Strong financial cases often resembled carefully assembled puzzles. Each witness added only a few pieces. Eventually, the picture became impossible to ignore. The following Tuesday, Leah testified. She wore a simple navy suit. No expensive jewelry. No attempt to impress anyone. Only quiet confidence. Frank sat in the public gallery for support. He intentionally chose a seat near the back. This was her moment, not his. The prosecutor approached gently. "Please state your name." "Leah Baker." "How long did you work for Horizon Health Solutions?" 11 years. The questioning remained respectful. "Professional." The prosecutor asked about marketing conferences, vendor recommendations, budget approvals, internal procedures. Leah answered every question directly. "I approved marketing expenditures only after receiving completed procurement documentation." "Were you responsible for verifying vendor ownership?" No. Were you responsible for confirming financial disclosures? No. What was your responsibility? Marketing strategy and approved promotional budgets. The prosecutor nodded. No drama, only clarity. Then came the difficult question. Did Mr. Mason Reynolds ever encourage expedited approval of certain vendors? Leah took a slow breath. Yes. How frequently? Occasionally. Did you believe those requests violated company policy? At the time, no. Why not? Because I believed the supporting documentation had already been properly reviewed. The courtroom remained silent. The prosecutor thanked her. Then the defense attorney stood. His cross-examination lasted less than 30 minutes. He attempted to suggest Leah should have asked more questions. She answered calmly. When documents appeared complete and multiple departments had already approved them, I had no objective reason to believe they were false. The defense attorney tried again. So you trusted your co-workers? Yes. Was that unreasonable? The attorney hesitated. No. Leah looked directly at the jury. I believed I worked with honest people. Nothing more needed to be said. When she stepped outside the courthouse several hours later, she released a long breath. Frank walked beside her without speaking. Finally, she smiled. It's over. You did well. I simply told the truth. I know. For the first time since Christmas, she appeared completely free. The following week, prosecutors introduced the financial evidence that had transformed the investigation. Shell companies, layered consulting agreements, property purchases, hidden ownership records, anonymous consulting fees. Jurors watched detailed charts explaining how millions of dollars had moved through multiple businesses before reaching personal accounts. The evidence was overwhelming. Victoria Hayes later summarized it during a phone call. They're not proving one fraudulent transaction. They're proving an entire system. Frank understood. Complex fraud rarely depended upon one fake invoice. It depended upon hundreds of transactions appearing ordinary when viewed separately. Together, they revealed intent. Several former executives accepted plea agreements before the defense finished presenting its case. Others continued fighting the charges. Mason Reynolds chose to testify. The courtroom filled beyond capacity that morning. Frank watched the proceedings from a live public broadcast at work. Mason appeared older than before. His confidence had faded. Dark circles rested beneath his eyes. The prosecutor questioned him carefully. You recommended Ashford Consulting? Yes. You recommended Pioneer Strategic? Yes. You recommended Northbridge Solutions? Yes. Did you disclose your financial relationship with those companies? No. The courtroom became perfectly still. The prosecutor displayed bank records, property purchases, corporate ownership documents. Each answer narrowed the remaining possibilities. Finally came the question everyone expected. Did you knowingly participate in directing company funds through businesses you secretly controlled? Mason remained silent for several seconds, then quietly answered, yes. The courtroom erupted with whispers. Frank leaned back slowly. Months earlier, he had only possessed patterns. Now the truth stood under oath. Mason continued answering questions for nearly 2 hours. He admitted creating false consulting arrangements. He admitted coordinating payments with David Mercer. He admitted concealing ownership interests. But one answer mattered more than all the others. Did Leah Baker knowingly participate in this scheme? No. Did she receive illegal payments? No. Did she know the documentation had been falsified? No. The prosecutor asked one final time. So she was unaware? Yes. Frank closed his eyes briefly, not because he needed confirmation, because Leah deserved to hear those words spoken publicly. That evening, they sat together on their back porch. Neither spoke for several minutes. Finally, Leah whispered, I've waited almost a year to hear that. Frank squeezed her hand. I know. I kept wondering whether people secretly blamed me. Some probably did. She nodded. But now they know. Yes. They do. Several weeks later, the jury returned its verdicts. David Mercer, guilty. Mason Reynolds, guilty. Multiple additional executives and contractors were convicted on fraud, conspiracy, wire fraud, and related financial crimes. Sentencing would occur later. The legal process still had chapters remaining. But the truth had finally become public record. That evening, Frank opened the old notebook one final time. He turned to the very first page. December, Christmas. Leah had asked him not to invite Caleb. At the time, it had felt like the beginning of the end. Instead, it had become the painful beginning of something stronger. He quietly closed the notebook and placed it back on the bookshelf. Its purpose had been fulfilled. The investigation had uncovered corruption. The trial had delivered accountability. But the greatest victory had never been the convictions. It had been bringing honesty back into the people he loved most. 1 year later, Christmas arrived once again. The first snow of December covered the neighborhood in a quiet blanket of white, softening rooftops and turning every porch light into a warm, golden glow. Frank stood outside before sunrise with a mug of coffee in his hands. Exactly 1 year earlier, Christmas had become the day his world began falling apart. Today it felt like the day everything had finally come back together. He smiled as he watched the lights inside his home flicker on one by one. There was laughter in the kitchen. Music played softly through the house. The smell of cinnamon roasted turkey and fresh bread drifted through the open doorway. For the first time in many years, Christmas felt simple again. Leah walked onto the porch wearing a thick winter sweater and wrapped both hands around her own cup of coffee. You've been out here for 10 minutes. I know. What are you thinking about? Frank looked across the quiet street. A year. That's all. Only 1 year. She nodded. It feels much longer. In some ways. She slipped her arm through his. I used to think success meant climbing higher. What do you think now? She smiled. I think success is waking up without fear. Frank looked at her. I agree. Neither of them said anything else. They simply stood together, watching the sunrise. Inside the house, Caleb's loud voice suddenly echoed through the hallway. If somebody doesn't help me with these boxes, I'm eating all the cookies myself. Leah laughed. Some things never change. Frank grinned. Thankfully. They walked back inside. The living room had become a familiar picture of family traditions. Evelyn carefully arranged handmade ornaments on the Christmas tree. Caleb carried wrapped presents with exaggerated effort, pretending each one weighed 50 pounds. His jokes made everyone laugh. Several nieces and nephews chased one another around the house while Christmas music filled every room. No one checked business news. No one discussed investigations. No one worried about hidden agendas. Peace had quietly returned. Leah walked toward the dining room carrying an old cardboard box. I found something. Frank recognized it immediately. The damaged Christmas ornament he had accidentally crushed the year before. She held it carefully. I had it repaired. He examined the tiny cracks that remained visible beneath the fresh paint. It isn't perfect anymore. No? She smiled warmly. But neither are we. He gently placed the ornament near the center of the tree. It's stronger than before. She squeezed his hand. So are we. A few minutes later, the doorbell rang. Frank opened the door. Standing outside was Daniel Ortiz, carrying 2 pies. I was told attendance was mandatory. Frank laughed. It absolutely was. Daniel stepped inside. I figured after everything we've all been through. This seemed more important than another office party. Frank nodded. I couldn't agree more. Throughout the afternoon, the house filled with conversation. Daniel shared stories from recent fraud investigations. Marcus Bennett arrived carrying homemade desserts prepared by his wife. Victoria Hayes stopped by after visiting relatives nearby. She jokingly announced, "I promise not to discuss compliance audits today." Everyone applauded. Even Frank laughed. For one afternoon, they allowed themselves to be ordinary people instead of investigators, consultants, attorneys, or executives. After lunch, the younger children begged everyone to play outside in the snow. Soon the front yard became a battlefield of snowballs and laughter. Caleb somehow convinced Marcus to build an enormous snowman. Daniel accidentally slipped while throwing a snowball and landed flat on his back. The children laughed so hard that even Daniel couldn't stop smiling. Frank watched everything from the porch beside Evelyn. She quietly observed the family for several minutes. "You know." "What?" "Your father always believed storms reveal foundations." Frank looked at her. I remember. He used to say that strong houses survive because nobody notices how much work went into building them." She looked toward Leah. "You two rebuilt yours." Frank followed her gaze. Leah was helping one of the children put a scarf around the snowman. She looked happier than he had seen in years. "I couldn't have done it alone?" "No," Evelyn smiled. "You finally learned that." As evening approached, everyone gathered around the dining room table. This time, every chair held exactly the person who belonged there. No uncomfortable substitutions, no hidden tensions, no forced smiles. Caleb sat beside Frank. Leah sat across from them. Evelyn occupied her usual seat at the end of the table. Before dinner began, Frank quietly stood. "I'd like to say something." The room fell silent. "A year ago, I thought Christmas had become the worst day of my life." Several people looked down. "I was angry. I was confused, and I honestly believed our family might never recover." He paused. "But something happened. We stopped pretending. We started listening. And we chose truth even when it hurt." He looked toward Leah. "I learned something this year." She smiled softly. "So did I." Frank continued. "Trust isn't built because nothing bad ever happens. It's built because people tell the truth after something bad does happen." The room remained completely silent. Caleb slowly raised his glass. "To truth." Evelyn raised hers. "To family." Marcus smiled. "To second chances." Daniel added, "And to never inviting a work husband to Christmas dinner." For a moment, everyone stared at him. Then the entire room exploded with laughter. Even Leah laughed until tears filled her eyes. "Fair enough. I definitely earned that." The tension completely disappeared. Dinner lasted for hours. Stories replaced apologies. Memories replaced regrets. Plans for future vacations replaced discussions about courtrooms. After dessert, the family exchanged gifts. Frank handed Leah a small wrapped package. She opened it carefully. Inside rested a leather-bound journal. The cover contained only 4 embossed words. "Write the next chapter." She looked at him with tears in her eyes. "What does this mean?" "It means our story isn't about what happened. It's about what we choose next." She hugged him tightly. "I love you." "I love you too." Later that night, after everyone had gone home and the dishes had finally been washed, Frank returned to the living room. The Christmas tree glowed quietly in the darkness. He noticed the repaired ornament hanging near the center. Its cracks were still visible. They had never disappeared. But they no longer represented damage. They represented survival. Leah joined him with 2 cups of hot chocolate. "You came back to look at the tree." "I did." "What are you thinking now?" Frank smiled. "A year ago I thought the broken ornament was the story. And now..." He looked at the repaired decoration. "It wasn't. It was just the beginning." Leah rested her head against his shoulder. Outside, fresh snow continued falling across the quiet neighborhood. Inside, the home was warm. Not because every problem had disappeared, not because life would never become difficult again, but because the people inside had learned that honesty, forgiveness, and family were stronger than pride, deception, and ambition. The greatest gift they received that Christmas was never wrapped beneath the tree. It was the chance to begin again. And this time they intended to protect what mattered most. Every story leaves us with a choice. We can focus on the betrayal, the disappointment, and the pain, or we can focus on what those difficult moments teach us. Frank and Leah's journey reminds us that trust is one of the most valuable things we will ever give another person. But trust should never replace wisdom. At the same time, wisdom should never destroy our ability to love. Life has a way of testing both our character and our relationships, often when we least expect it. The people who emerge stronger are not the ones who never face hardship, but the ones who choose honesty over pride, forgiveness over resentment, and truth over comfortable lies. Sometimes the greatest victories are not found in courtrooms, promotions, or public recognition. They are found around a dinner table where broken relationships are restored, sincere apologies are accepted, and families decide to move forward together. Scars may never completely disappear, just as a repaired ornament still carries its cracks, but those scars become reminders of resilience rather than defeat. They prove that what was once broken can become even stronger when rebuilt with love, patience, and integrity. If this story touched your heart or reminded you of someone in your own life, we'd love to hear from you. What lesson spoke to you the most? Have you ever experienced a moment when truth changed everything? Share your thoughts and personal experiences in the comments below. Your story might inspire someone else who needs hope today. And if you enjoy powerful stories about family justice, forgiveness, and second chances, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next inspiring story. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.